Many of you can in the background. We have food and coffee and so on. And so please feel free to help yourselves. We have a very full day today. And so I don't want to say a great deal at the outset other than a brief word of welcome and a word also of appreciation for this opportunity to convene what I think is a very important conference jointly with the Japan Economic Foundation and its director, Masa Toyoda, who has been a good friend and an interlocutor, a very stimulating interlocutor with us for many years. I think, as most of you know, he has had a very distinguished career at METI, culminating in the Vice Minister for International Affairs, Director General of the Japan Energy Research Institute, and with a deep interest and expertise also in areas relating to technology and space and so on. So I think you'll find the interaction with him and his colleagues really to be very stimulating. As I think all of us are keenly aware, we are at a point of important transition in international affairs and in U.S.-Japan relations. Different ways of thinking. I guess I've been wrestling with this question of what sort of a transition are we in and what sort of forces are driving the system for, certainly for the better part of a decade through three of the major books that I've done recently, the New Continentalism in 2012, about a year before the Belt and Road, stressing the new world across Eurasia that was beginning to open with the collapse of the Soviet Union and, of course, the combination of that and the very rapid growth of China. And then building on that in my supercontinent book in 2019. We've got, of course, different aspects to the global chessboard. It isn't only nation states that are worked. Of course, the multinational corporations are a key part of that. I guess having worked with Ray Vernon as well as Edwin Reischauer, and with Dan Yergin also, of course, being a close friend, the very notion of the commanding heights, which to Yergin, of course, were the multinationals, was something that I've been thinking a lot about. And then cities, a couple of books that I did, Global Political Cities, Asia and Washington. Those elements in the chessboard, the subnationals, the NGOs, are also clear elements. So this conference, of course, focuses on the special areas, the special sectors that we have, and I speak especially for for both of us, that we have focused on. Certainly energy is a key dimension of that, technology and energy, but of course, global order and how to, in this world of turbulence that we have, how do we sustain some coherent pattern of global order or build to a more coherent system. The transition point, I guess I tend to think, putting all this and reflecting on a little last night, of course, there are the things like that go way back, the beginnings of globalization, 1970s, the China that has continued quite steadily until very recently, and from the late 1970s, early 1980s on as well. But 2008 and the global financial crisis it seems to me, might be the most important critical juncture that has, today configures the choices, the critical choices that a lot of us have. Of course, in that case, China launched a massive stimulus package that contrasted sharply to the deepening recession in the G7 nations. Not long after that, of course, at the end of 2012, we got new leadership in China with Xi Jinping. And this combination of greater Chinese capabilities and then a more assertive, more proactive approach to the world created or deepened that challenge in both its economic and some of its security dimensions. But the stagnation, the difficulties of growth in the transition from 2008 also, of course, ignited a deeper wave of populism in many of the advanced industrial nations in the 2010 election in the United States. And of course, in many ways, even more so, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 epitomized this in some ways, although, of course, it has had elements, Boris Johnson, and various elements in Marine Le Pen, in other advanced nations. So the rise of China, the challenge of China, the challenge of populism in the way that it relates to these issues of global order, and of course to energy. I could, obviously, the transformation, the rising dissatisfaction in Russia, and ultimately culminating in the Ukraine war, 2022. That certainly is another thread. The deepening, the acceleration of technological change, also in energy, greater efficiencies and possibilities in renewables, changes in the situation on nuclear power, particularly after 2011, with developments in areas such as batteries that made renewables more possible than they had been. So I think along all of these lines, since 2008 particularly, we have begun to see more clearly the real changes that confront the world that we have today. I don't want to go on any longer. This is simply to say we see a world of challenge, and we see a world, of course, of unsolved problems as well, at a point of, obviously, political transition as well. How sharp that transition will be, of course, could very well depend on some of the developments that we see in the coming weeks and months. So I thought this is a very timely time. It's a time, and I'm sure we'll see this theme. The one last point that I would want to make was the combination of the rise of China with technological change, the rise of populism in some countries, but strikingly not in Japan. I had an interesting talk with Joseph Nye of Harvard a couple of days ago, and he was noting that Japan is the one major industrialized nation that doesn't seem to have been as strongly affected by this. Not to say maybe in the current political system it's different, but in any case, there are certain, in this world of change, there are certain strengths, enduring strengths, to my mind, that Japan has as well. And so the question of US-Japan cooperation in this kind of a turbulent world, what sort of a broader global system of order can we find that will redound to the benefits of our two countries? These kind of issues, I hope it will get insights into those sorts of problems. So with that, and also with appreciation, as I say, for this opportunity of working together with the Japan Economic Foundation. I look forward to hearing from my co-chair, Masa Toyota. Thank you very much.
It's not. I'm sorry, the microphone's not. It's pretty.
Very good morning to seemingly the mic is not functioning. My voice. So now that's possible. I'm Katsu Toyoda, Japan Economic Foundation, which is international economic affairs. Thank you very much for joining us today for this Japan forum together with SAIS. Particularly, I'm very happy about this that we have known 20 years, perhaps 80 years before. I was in teaching in principle. Almost. When he was working in Japanese embassy, American embassy in Tokyo, I've been working closely with this. At that time, cooperation, important purposes, sometimes be the confrontation. But despite of confrontation, we could work very closely together. JEF, Japan Economic Foundation, was established in 1981, so almost 40 years ago. This is the real Japan and sought to enhance communication with other states here. We have several missions, major activities, three. One, publishing Japan Spotlight. It's bi-monthly. Now we are publishing electrically. Which analyze the changing global economy, impact on Japan and the world. Second, actually this second activity, holding discussion forum with US, Japan, US, EU, and Asia, and having a dialogue in international affairs. Study Japan Economic Foundation, because we work from outside. New about economic order. industrial cooperation, competitiveness, and also possible Taiwan and China. We have many issues. So throughout our long history of conducting projects like this forum, while the economic situation has changed dramatically, especially past, let's say, 5 years, when US-China confrontation is getting inspired. Suddenly, we are talking about that my view. We see the obvious rise of authoritarian leaders trying to expand their territories, enforcing economic, political, and military powers. Just as we plan to take off again to restore economy after COVID-19, the crisis in Ukraine invaded by Russia happened, and now we are seeing the Gaza conflict and US-China economic confrontation is continuing in a more intense manner. I was surprised to see or to hear in the past 1 year, more than 3 people in Gaza were killed, and almost 20, well, I would say 2,000 people were killed in Israel. What is this? What does this mean? And in Ukraine, in the past 3.5 I would say 70,000 US soldiers were killed, and perhaps 30,000 people in Ukraine were killed. What does this mean? It's really a sad thing we have to think about. And just after kick off again to restore our economy, we are facing such a sad incident. The 2 sessions on energy and environment, as well as international order, that we will hear today, will be covering those topics. These are all intertwined in a sense. It's very interesting. Energy, environment, and international order, both of them intertwined. So maybe 10 years ago, we didn't think about it, but at this moment, we have to think about these 2 relationships between 2 important issues. So therefore, topics in the sessions are extremely timely to be discussed, especially in the time of our new leaders who are going to change. I don't know in Japan who have changed, but nobody knows who is going to stay. It's really sensitive issues. But at the time of change of political structure in both countries, we are going to discuss these sort of issues. But particularly US presidential election, everybody in the world are watching what would happen. I hope things should be moving to the right direction. What is what is the right direction depends on the person. We will definitely be hearing a very lively discussion ahead, but let us not finish only with discussions. It will be quite important to draw out some solutions, I would say, to be reflected in respective policy from
now on, we have not only people from academia, but also we have people from industry, and also we have people from government, or at least people with government experiences. So I hope, in addition to finding what is happening, we really like to find some solutions. So now let us enjoy this special occasion today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you again, Toyota-san. Now, because of the time factor, we'll move right into our first panel today, which deals with energy. And if the participants in our panel might come forward, more or less, it's very flexible, but in the order that we have indicated in the program. As people are doing that, what I might just do to set the stage is to say a word about overall what we'll be looking at. In our first presentation by Yukari Yamashita, we'll be looking at the efficiency dimension of energy, obviously in terms of relating energy to environment. The question of efficiency is right at the center, because first and foremost, of course, reducing emissions through simply cutting energy usage. Well, then we're looking at resources, and then the global dimension of energy, and then a special focus on Japan. So roughly, if Yamashita-san, and then Ishii-san, and then Christopher Elsner, and then Jennifer Skleru. If everyone could come forward, and then we'll begin our discussion. Suggested. First of all, let's look at the energy efficiency question. And then, of course, to look at the resource availability question. I suppose the issue of transition from some of the most polluting fuels like coal towards some of the alternatives. And then, of course, the global dimension, the global context in which this energy transition takes place. And then Professor Skleru focusing particularly on Japan, and she has an important new book relating to renewables and Japanese policies relating to that. So with that, Professor Yamashita. If you like, yeah, maybe that would be easier. We'll do the discussion later on. And of course, we would like to have a interactive, strongly interactive element to this, but the initial presentation.
Okay. May I? Good morning, everybody. My name is Yukari Yamashita. I'm from the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. I prepared a little bit of lines, so I will try to keep myself in 10 minutes. Okay, last week, IEA announced its World Energy Outlook, and IEJ, my office, announced its annual outlook. The subtitle of our outlook, IEJ Outlook 2025, is How to Approach the Uncertainty of the Energy Transition. I think it echoes what we are talking about in this session today. The global launch of IEA's WEO World Energy Outlook this year was centering around STEPS and APS, which are trend scenario and NDC-based scenario, and not their favorite net zero scenario. And this indicates that shock of geopolitical turmoil felt by the world, and we feel that finally IEA has remembered their initial mission or raison d'etre, which is to secure stable energy supply. I must admit that this truly matches the exact point we have been trying hard to spotlight. The real issue is how to transform their energy system while economy and population are growing. This is what developing Asia, especially India and ASEAN, are facing as they try to meet the net zero target while leading the increasing energy consumption in the world. IEJ Outlook is known for our rather realistic scenario where about 13 gigatons of CO2 emissions remain even in the year 2050. Our maximum effort scenario, called Advanced Technology Scenario, states that energy efficiency improvements are the biggest contributing technologies of CO2 emissions reduction. IEJ's message has 4 points. 1, we should pursue potential of energy efficiency more. 2, we should recognize inherent issues brought by variable renewable electricity and consider more use of power storage or integration and installation of transmission lines. 3, role of CCUS and CDR or other negative emission technologies is increasing, and we need to remember the importance of stable supply of fossil fuels, especially natural gas, during energy transition. I have been asked to comment on Japan's solid strength in global warming efforts, particularly in the area of energy efficiency in relation to bilateral or state-to-state policy cooperation between Japan and the United States and third countries. At COP28, the goal was set to double the speed of efficiency improvement by 2030. In numbers, this means improving GDP intensity from 2% to 4% by 2030. This is quite a challenge. The average improvement of global GDP intensity in the preceding years was only about 1%. Before and after 2022, it was 0.8% in 21 and 1.3% in 23. Indicating that the pace of improvement in 2022 was very high, exceptionally high. The reason for this is the year 2022 was a year in which Europe was forced to save extreme amount of energy due to economic sanctions against Russia, and it was extremely high at 7% in Germany and the UK, 8% in Italy, and 13% in France. Moreover, this was not so much an improvement in energy efficiency. It was rather a result of the energy conservation that people put up with. However, the efficiency improvement potential of emerging and developing countries is large and has great potential. Therefore, I would like to point out that it is also an important option to go back to the basics and accelerate measures to reduce the amount of energy required for economic and social activities. In our analysis, more than half of the cumulative CO2 reductions from the 2050 reference scenario to the advanced technology scenario have always been contributed by energy-saving technologies or energy efficiency improvement. Many of the energy efficiency improvement technologies are actually existing technologies. One of the reasons for this is that efficiency improvement has long been said to be a low-hanging fruit for global warming countermeasures, but it has not been widely used in emerging and developing countries. We estimate that by 2050, more than 70% of the energy savings expected to be achievable globally compared to the reference scenario in these countries. In particular, India, MENA, and ASEAN together account for more than 1/4 of the world's total. Therefore, the key to ensuring a stable global energy supply and combating climate change is to promote efficiency improvement and decarbonization in these countries as soon as possible. Then what are the existing technologies? Boilers and industrial machineries, thermal insulation measures for buildings and openings in the consumer sector, electrical equipment for heating and cooling and various applications, fuel efficiency and then switching to hybrid and electric vehicles in the transportation sector, and the development and utilization of public transportation. The potential for energy efficiency improvement in emerging and developing countries is enormous, and compared to developed countries, relatively inexpensive energy-saving options remain. However, the potential of high-efficiency technologies is often not realized due to the lack of standards, systems, incentives, and information provision, and the high initial cost associated with the introduction of high-efficiency technologies. In order to formulate standards, it is necessary to incorporate all of these, such as lighting and building standards, air conditioning regulations, automobile fuel efficiency regulations, motor standards, and regulations related to energy management. However, due to lack of human resources and know-how, all of these are not necessarily in place in emerging and developing countries. In order to solve these issues, it is essential for developed countries to support the formation of institutions, transfer of know-how, and implement energy-saving projects. Both the United States and Japan have various effective programs related to energy efficiency improvement. Therefore, support for the establishment of efficiency improvement policies with reference to these specific programs is also very effective. For example, we both have energy performance regulation for building code and energy service companies, which aim at converting building to net zero energy building, and energy efficiency standards to improve equipment efficiency, such as Japan's Top Runner program and the US Energy Star program. Energy management, which promotes energy efficiency at factories and other facilities, is also an effective means of raising awareness of efficiency improvement and increasing effectiveness. With the progress of electrification, it will become increasingly important to improve the efficiency of electric appliances. In addition, there is a lot of room for research on how to effectively match the balance between power supply and demand due to the increase in variable renewable energy. Currently in Japan, we are discussing how to combine policies to improve the energy efficiency and those to promote use of non-fossil fuels, how to consider power load leveling, or to optimize demand response, and to combine communication technology optimization with energy saving. Urgent issue which is emerging in both Japan and the US is how to respond to the increase in power consumption in AI, data centers, semiconductor manufacturing, and other IT-related industries. At present, the spotlight is on the increase in power consumption due to the increase in the number of such tech giant offices and factories, but our expectations are for various tasks in many different sectors will eventually become more energy efficient through usage of AI and digitalization. The analysis on this point is so far very limited. Therefore, even the IEA's latest outlook relies widely on power use. If there is a high expectation of power saving through efficiency improvement, the increase in power consumption will be limited. But if it is not expected to be much, the power consumption will increase significantly. If Japan and the United States cooperate to realize such energy efficiency improvement role of AIs and other digital technologies, the energy saving effects of digitalization is expected to have a significant effect on a global scale. To give another example, in the case of critical minerals, the uneven distribution of not only resources, but also refining capacity raises concern. Especially concentration in China is a concern from the economic security perspective. It would be a great contribution if we could develop technologies that use less critical minerals in storage batteries, wind power, solar power, and motors. A few more lines. The next issue that has been recognized is how to prioritize investments. Achieving a decarbonized net zero society is costly. We already start to read reports on phenomenon described as investment fatigue. Scrapping existing infrastructure, replacing them with brand new set of infrastructure is costly. Do more with energy efficiency improvement is something we should remember to do in collaboration between the United States and Japan, developing into cooperation with other likely-minded countries. I hope to see such collaborations will speed up our efforts while utilizing our limited resources effectively. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. What you have to say is that to the discussion later on. It's like Japan's role in the efficiency being as great as it is in the relationship versus the development programs and certain large countries like India in relation to this transfer. I think we have kind of something which regularly going into those next speaker. Japan organization for those security. John, very much.
Thank you for having me today. So I want to use my presentation slide today. So I'm Hirotaka Ishii, I'm General Manager of JAGMEC, Washington, D.C. branch. So my background is before joining the JAGMEC Washington, D.C. branch, I worked for METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, for about 20 years. Mainly my background, most of my career is related to energy policy, nuclear power, hydrogen, ammonia, CCS, and electricity market reform and gas market reform, etc. So today I want to show you Japanese current energy situation, and we want to have a discuss. So, thank you. This is a picture of a former Prime Minister Kishida. So this slide shows Japanese pledge to address the climate change. Japan has made a global pledge for reducing GHG emission by 46% in 2030 and achieving net zero GHG emission by 2050. We think in order to fulfill this commitment, lots of investment in different fields is needed. We think that this will require more than 150 trillion yen. It is $1 trillion over the next decade through public-private partnership. So this slide shows Japan's CO2 emission and the global energy-related CO2 emissions. In Japan, CO2 emissions from power sector accounts for 40%. Japan's CO2 emission account for about 3% of the global energy-related CO2 emissions. China's accounts for about 30%. US accounts for about 50% of it. We think that it is important for Japan not only to achieve our carbon neutrality of my country but also contribute to global emission reductions. So this slide is Japan's major energy climate policy packages. We call the effort to address the climate change and more the green transformation, which is GX. GX will transform our entire industrial and social structures centering around fossil energy sources into ones based on clean energy. Based on this concept, the government of Japan announced the basic policy for realization of GX in February 2023. We think that green transformation should deliver both emission reduction and economic growth. Also, we believe that successful GX initiatives enhance competitiveness of companies and nations. So this slide shows three principles of the green transformation. And the first is the triple breakthrough. We think that we have to achieve emission reduction, economic growth, and energy security. Second is one goal, various pathways. The countries across the world share a common goal, but we have to achieve it through various pathways, depending on the circumstances of each country. The third is that Japan will contribute to global decarbonization by providing solutions. So in order to invest more than 150 trillion yen, which is $1 trillion for 10 years, we think that the investment must offer, we think that the government must offer long-term multi-year support program for private business. To this end, we have launched a new GX economy transition bond program. These bonds can be leveraged to offer broad support for advanced investment. The support will be offered by the government for the investment in switching to renewable energies, nuclear, and other non-fossil energies, and CCS and other technologies. So let's move on to the story of the legislation recently enacted recently to achieve the carbon neutrality. One of them is Hydrogen Society Act, left side. This act, hydrogen and its derivatives, ammonia, e-fuel, e-methane, key enablers for achieving carbon neutrality in the industrial sectors, including iron or steel, chemical, mobility, or power generation sectors. The Hydrogen Society Promotion Bill was passed in May this year. Based on this act, the Japanese government will provide supporting measures, which means subsidy, to the approved hydrogen business plan to promote supply and utilization of low carbon hydrogen and its initiatives. Also, in order to enable private sector companies to start CCS project in Japan by 2030, the CCS business bill has passed in May this year. So actually, most recent my job, current job, was drafting these bills. So let's move on to the Southern Asia countries situation. So although many ASEAN countries have announced their intention for carbon neutrality, but please see the generation mix. Many of them heavily depended on coal and natural gas-fired power generation. As a demand for electricity further increase in line with economic growth, it is essential to promote decarbonization in the particular manner. To this end, cooperation through Japanese technology, finance, and experience, and ASEC Asia Zero Emission Community platform are also important. So next slide is Japan's power generation mix. So before the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident, which occurred in 2011, over 25% of electricity is generated by nuclear power plants in Japan. Look at 2010. So also at that time, we had over 50 nuclear power plants in Japan. So right now, so only 12 nuclear power stations have been restarted right now. As a result, the electricity generated by nuclear power plants account for only about 5% right now. According to strategic energy plan, so nuclear power plant will account for approximately 20 to 22% of total power generation mix in 2030. So in order to achieve this target, giving top priority to safety, we will facilitate the restart of the nuclear reactors that have passed safety reviews by a nuclear regulation authority and have gained local understandings. Also, Japan is discussing right now to revise the strategic energy plan right now. So I think that we should rethink the role of nuclear power station in order to achieve carbon neutrality. So let's move on to the critical mineral issue. So minerals are essential components in many of today's rapidly growing clean energy technologies, from wind turbines and electricity networks to electric vehicles. The International Energy Agency, IEA, and other reliable entities estimate that the demand for these minerals, for example, copper, silicon, rare earths, lithium, will grow quickly as clean energy transition gather pace. So this slide shows the challenges related to critical minerals. So China is a dominant player in global critical minerals supply chain. There is growing concerns that a high level of dependence on China for these minerals may create energy security crisis. It is important for countries across the world, especially the Western countries, to ensure stable critical mineral supply chain. So this is my last slide. Japan is discussing to revise the strategic energy plan right now, as I said before. So under this discussion, S plus 3E, which means safety plus energy security, economic efficiency, environment, is our principle. So this climate change and the Russia military invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has dramatically changed the world's energy situation. I think that there is now a risk of the first full-scale energy crisis since the oil crisis of 1973. We can see a lot of discussions to ensure energy security across the globe. I think that this principle, S plus 3E, could work all countries across the world. Thank you.
So, like I think many of us, I can see all kinds of questions here. You talk about the danger of an energy crisis. What kind of a crisis might that be, and why? Of course, you talked about critical minerals and many issues relating to resources. The one issue that I didn't hear, I hope you can raise it a little, is the transition question of, you know, from to renewables ultimately, and issues like LNG, the role as a transition fuel that LNG can singly like that. But then all sorts of other issues. I look forward to the discussion. As our next speaker, we have Christopher Elstner, I'm proud to say is a SAIS alum, and also a very distinguished energy analyst. He's currently serving as Associate Director in Energy Wide Perspectives for S&P Global Commodities. And we're talking with executives of Fortune 500 companies in that connection on energy markets. Also has been teaching for us here at SAIS. And he's an excellent teacher and a very interesting analyst. Chris, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Hello. Thank you for your time. Firstly, I think I would identify a couple of other developments, geopolitical developments since the global financial crisis, which surely was an inflection point for the geopolitical landscape and the international order. That would be right now, which is crucial, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine. I think you saw in that last slide that energy security was number one of the 3 E's. And I think that's something that's definitely come to the fore, particularly since not only the invasion of Ukraine, but the deep freeze in Texas in 2021, where we saw gas price spikes. But really, one of the major geopolitical developments that Japan is benefiting from is the rise first of shale gas in the United States, and then subsequently tight oil over the course of 13 and 14. You can try to imagine the geopolitical implications of an invasion of Ukraine with a US that is not producing the most oil volume in the world, as well as growing LNG exports. The economic implications globally would have been much different than what they currently are. And so I'm looking not only at the transition, but those fuels that they currently rely on in Japan and can have a real overlap in terms of US-Japan relations and potential cooperation in energy. So as we're talking about decarbonization, this is largely going to be a market-driven talk because others are definitely covering those next generation fuels, your CCS, your hydrogen. But another inflection point is really COVID, partially coincidentally, but that is when we started getting the large companies as well as NDCs or nationally determined contributions from large nations. And this is when we got a lot of the net zero goals in 2020 and 2021. And right now we are actually getting to a point when we're seeing some headwinds from supply chains, not only in renewables, but also in battery energy storage. And we're also really in a sort of a nascent phase for some of those technologies we surely will be relying upon for decarbonization, such as CCS and electrolysis to make green hydrogen. But a crucial portion will be, as you can see, and was shown in the last talk, fossil fuels still make up a sizable proportion of the power sector. And for Japan, electrification is crucial to achieve those decarbonization targets. We will get to refined product and sort of the decline. Will be really, it's more of a population shrink and energy efficiency that will really put downward pressure on demand for oil. However, as I said previously, it's not only energy security in terms of securing your supply, but in terms of power sector, it's grid reliability. And so that is crucial, particularly to politicians and policymakers. If you have rolling brownouts and blackouts, you will have very many angry voters who will probably vote for your opponent in the next election. And so it's crucial to find those sources of supply. But in terms of finding 24-hour dispatchable power that is proven economically, currently, it is nuclear for now. And so we need to see an advance in the technology and the cost structure of scaled grid scale energy storage, which is facing headwinds from an EV market that largely is monopolizing not only the input critical minerals, but the output in terms of batteries. Really, the electric vehicle market is taking up a vast majority of the technologies in any sort of energy storage or battery. That's not to say that battery energy storage aren't growing. The IRA has supported battery energy storage vastly. In our base case outlook, the US and China will grow battery energy storage. But nuclear will be a central point if Japan is serious about decarbonization. Safe nuclear power will definitely be a key point. One thing that was brought up recently, overall, because of the shrinking demographics in Japan, we were previously going to see power demand shrink overall. But now, given our base case outlook for AI and data centers, going from 20 trillion watt hours now until about when we think sort of by mid-century, 60 trillion watt hours. But this will basically be, and I'm not going to read it to you, obviously, but this is another, we're talking about Japan as just sort of a nation, but you do have to start looking regionally in terms of where you're going to grow your power demand. And so we see a lot of the data centers based around Tokyo. So even if you do build out, and we have a base case of about 5 gigawatts of renewables incrementally annually out to mid-century in Japan, but where they're located, the data centers won't necessarily be able to avail themselves of neither nuclear, except for in the environs of Tokyo. And in the previous slide, we did see that in our base case, we do see the Kashiwazaki unit number 7 coming online in March, but that has not achieved a local approval as yet. But those are the types of systems and sources of supply for power that those data centers will need to source. And primarily, it'll be natural gas. So as you can see from this red line, that's what the DCs or the data centers will be able to access in terms of renewable power. And so there will be a lasting role for natural gas in a grid that delivers reliable power. Now it's shifting its function. Some of the new incremental gas sources will be more peakers that are kind of counterbalancing renewables and their variability. Because what you do not want is large bits of curtailment. We're starting to see this particularly in the European market, where day-ahead wholesale power prices have gone negative. And that certainly doesn't entice project developers to deploy more investment and build out more generation, unless you have that, what they call downside flex. And you can actually bring load down as demand comes down during the evening hours or during the midday. So as natural gas will sort of feature centrally, at least over this transitional period of the 30s and into the 40s, the US will play a prominent role. And by 2040, we think that the US will be supplying nearly 50% of all LNG to Japan, albeit very much lower than previously, than we see currently in terms of imports. But generally speaking, we still have Australia providing the most. And LNG really peaked, not surprisingly, in 2014 at about 89 million tons and has declined all the way to half that currently in terms of imports. But also what you want to see up here also is a diversity of supply. And so that'll be crucial for energy security, something that also China strives for in terms of policy is diversification of supplier. And so that's certainly what we're seeing in terms of Japan's imports. And yes, natural gas will continue to sort of decline in the medium to long term. But the interesting thing about the near term, and we're seeing this actually in Europe as well, is as they implement policies, particularly in the electrification of heating for residential and commercial buildings, you're installing electric heat pumps, but that electricity is generated by natural gas. So you've backed natural gas out as a primary fuel source, only to replace it as a secondary fuel source. So that's certainly going to happen in many markets, particularly in the developed world, over the course of the late 2020s and into the 2030s. So that will be central. Then we can talk about overall, you can start to use that natural gas infrastructure to retrofit and transition into hydrogen, should those cost efficiencies really emerge. And that should be a crucial portion in terms of efficiency. Do not scrap pipelines and build carbon pipelines or hydrogen pipelines anew. You can retrofit some of these pieces of infrastructure. And then finally, really another place where we can have a lot of cooperation, and do in terms of discussing the issues at hand. Is the U.S. supply of crude or refined products, albeit to a shrinking market, as you can see, really led by that transport sector. But because of the enduring importance and priority the Gulf exporters, oil exporters place on Japan as a market, they will be very hard to dislodge. And politically, we don't necessarily, as the U.S., want to try to take a bunch of the Japanese market from the Saudis and the Emiratis because of how important it is to them, unless Japan wants to make a proactive attempt to diversify those crude sources more. We are seeing consolidation in the downstream and the refining in Japan, really driven not only by EV penetration, but in the next few years, really more by fuel efficiency standards. And so higher fuel efficiency in the near term, and then a penetration of not only EVs, but hydrogen fuel cells in Japan, we see as eroding traditional refined product demand in Japan. And so those are the sources that really are driving the Japanese economy currently. And certainly they're going to have to deal with, if they want a reliable grid, thermal playing a lasting role at least into the 2030s and 2040s, because you really do need that reliability and continued power for your economy to really grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for again. In the energy future of the U.S. system. Of this energy transition, that's an interesting new look at some experience on Japan-related energy issues, and also proud to say another SAIS alum, Professor Schluter from Hopkins.
I'll actually take these off because I can see the screen from here, but I can still see you. So thank you, everyone. I'm actually thrilled that I got to build on my three colleagues' conversations, because we've heard about technologies, we've heard about resources, and we've heard about economics. And I would like to talk about resilience. And you heard a little bit about resilience from each of them. But I want to talk about resilience from the perspective of priorities of different groups. And this, as Dr. Calder mentioned, is in my book. But I want to talk about that these resilience priorities and implications for cooperation across Japan and the U.S. So I will not only be talking about Japan, but also about the U.S. So there are several sets of resilience priorities that the different stakeholder groups within government and outside of government in Japan and the U.S. and anywhere have when it comes to energy systems. And the traditional one we think about is engineering resilience. So how do we get back to where we were when there's a shock, any kind of shock? Ecological resilience is we don't have to go back to exactly where we were, but we need to adapt and move forward. Social and that ecological resilience also includes the sustainability features that we're talking about today, so decarbonization, things like that. And then social resilience is focused more on people, so resource availability, but also accessibility to those resources, acceptability of them. So do the populations and communities that are receiving energy or electricity from those sources accept those sources? That's been a challenge locally in many places in the US and Japan. And then quality of life. And we also can combine those into socio-ecological resilience. So all of those factors combined together. And then there's economic resilience. And historically, when we talk about resilience, we think about engineering, ecological, social as all kind of energy security and environment. And economic resilience has always been considered as kind of separate. And that is where we end up facing challenges because we start to see this conflict that is perceived across these different types of resilience. And you can picture which stakeholders might gravitate more towards prioritizing one type of resilience over another. So we really needed a way to bring these together so that economic resilience is not pitted against energy security and environment, not pitted against engineering, ecological, and social resilience. So we have to add something. We can't just talk about the 3 E's if we're talking about this type of conflict, right? We have to talk about politics and we have to talk about energy policymaking process because those two elements will influence the way these priorities come together across groups and the ways that these groups can collaborate or not. So this was my effort at 2 Venn diagrams. I'm sorry if it looks complicated. And actually it was supposed to be a flag on the left and a flag on the right. So it got converted to graphics. So the Japanese embodiment of this Venn diagram of the 3 E's and the US one. So on the left, we have, and you'll see some overlap. So if we look at these three E's resilience priorities and their influence on US and Japanese energy and climate strategies, if we think about Japan, we have energy storage, grid access, right? So access to the grid for energy storage as kind of a solidly energy security priority. And then we have securing mineral and battery supply chains, which really spans all 3 E's, right? Because we're thinking about energy security. They are used for environmental purposes when we think about renewables. And we have to think about the economics of those supply chains as well. And we have renewables to replace older, more inefficient coal plants. And that's also happening in Japan. And so from that perspective, again, all 3 E's, right? Because we want to have something to replace those plants, energy security. We want to have something that is replacing these older, less efficient plants that are also not as clean. So environmental and economics. And then we have offshore wind, hydrogen, and ammonia moving forward. And you heard about those today as well. And so those also kind of span the environment and economics, a little bit of energy security as well in there, right? And then we have this land use debate that has been emerging in the localities. So several prefectures have either implemented or plan to implement regulations that would restrict use of solar in particular in forested areas. And this is from somewhat of an environmental perspective, so perspective of deforestation, but also the perspective of the feed-in tariff enabling an abundance of solar cropping up in places where it might not be easily used, or where it might be easily used, but then if there is a challenge, a weather event, a landslide, then we have additional challenges to the environment. So environmental aspects of that land use for renewables. And then we have grid usage fees levied on renewables producers from the economic perspective. And you will see some overlap. Now, for the US, I tried to fast forward and think about places where there might be overlap, not in execution, but in some of the framing of priorities, no matter which administration we have next year. So either a Trump administration or a Harris administration would be looking at use of federal lands. The difference is that the Trump administration would be focused on oil and gas, and the Harris administration would tie the use of the oil and gas to offshore wind, as they have done in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Both would be looking at made and mined in the US. So we hear a lot about made in the US in a Trump platform, but the Inflation Reduction Act actually has a lot of provisions for made in the US, mined in the US when it comes to critical minerals. So that particular aspect is also some overlap, even though the execution is different and the actual focus is different. Securing mineral and battery supply chains, also important. Again, just like in Japan, we are focused on, where our supply chain is coming from and our role in it. So the potential for possible development of critical minerals in the US, but also securing supply chains elsewhere. Streamlined permitting. So again, it would depend on which administration we get as to which types of permits would be streamlined. We have seen movement in this current administration and would see in the future streamlined permitting for renewables. We've seen that at the local level as well. New York was kind of the flagship for that. But then we also, obviously, if it were a Trump administration, we would be hearing about it from the fossil fuels perspective and potentially nuclear perspective as well. And then in terms of environment, we do hear about land use issues with renewables as well. We have challenges facing wildlife, particularly protected wildlife, biodiversity in different places around the country when it comes to solar and wind development. So deserts in California, but also locations elsewhere. So we can see that there is overlap and there is an opportunity for some collaboration on some of these issues within the two countries, but also across. And so I'd like to talk, I said that economics has always been considered separate. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of economic resilience for renewables in particular. So battery prices have been forecast to fall. This is Goldman Sachs. And so we can see that there's been a bump, a little bit of a bump, but it was still declining. And then now predicted a serious decline in battery prices. And that is in part due to the slight stabilization of the supply chains and roles of different places that are jumping in to try to produce some of these critical minerals. And then if we add to that the decline in costs for utility scale PV, photovoltaic panels, particularly the crystalline silicon rotating panels, not the stationary ones, the tracking panels instead of the stationary ones. If we add those together, we can see that the potential for utility scale energy storage increases. However, we currently have a huge backlog of projects that are waiting for connection to the grid. So the interconnection capability is improving, but we have a big backlog already. And that might continue if we see these trends, economic trends, encouraging more connections, but we don't have the ability to implement them. So for all of this, the companies will be key. I had been hearing from some companies that they will not reverse because they've already invested, they've already received the funding, grant money, et cetera. And so their projects are moving forward. That said, we had an interesting conversation at dinner last night, and there are many companies that have not yet received their funding or have received the funding but have not yet planned out what exactly they're going to do with that funding. And so if it disappears in the next administration in the US, then we may not have those companies moving forward, or we likely will not have those companies moving forward with their renewables investments and grid storage, battery storage investments. So it really will depend a lot on what's happening in the next few months. However, the companies that have moved forward already are likely to continue. So we will see places in the US, around the country, where, especially given the conversation about data centers and the pressure they are putting on the states in which they are located to enable them to have secure supply on site or nearby. And a lot of those are tied to renewables. Plus, this movement over the past decade or so by the renewables companies to give funding in Republican states. So they are funding Republican state projects, funding politicians in Republican states. Those trends may enable some movement at the state level, even when we don't see it if we don't see it at the federal level. So that brings me to a little bit more of a conversation on politics and process. And we have an upcoming election. Japan has a new prime minister with a focus on hydropower and geothermal, and less so on solar and wind, and also upcoming elections at the state and local levels for lower house and for us Congress. So we have possibilities of change, right? Further change. And if we talk about the process, so I mentioned that there are some states that may be leading in the US. California has always been considered a leader, right? So they're out ahead on auto emission standards. They're out ahead on a lot of the technologies and incentives. Massachusetts also, every year, if we think about energy efficiency, Yamashita-san's conversation, Massachusetts has been at the top of the list every single year in data that has been collected for energy efficiency incentives. Massachusetts and California kind of flip-flop as to who's first and who's second every year. New York also has legislation that was at the forefront for zero carbon, and their movement was to streamline siting and permitting for renewables and also involve communities in those discussions and make sure the communities were compensated and engaged. So different perspective, but still moving on decarbonization. And then Texas, huge amount of wind, and also tied with California for the largest amount of battery storage in 2023. So the issue with this is that if we were to have another Trump administration, they did in the previous one impose limits on states. So they told California, no, you do not get a waiver for your auto emissions standards. You cannot go beyond the federal level standard. And so if we see those kinds of limits coming through the EPA as they did, or the Supreme Court as they have, and executive orders as they did, then we may see an inability for the states to move forward as much as they would like, even with the ability for states to do something different than the federal level. If we have a Harris administration, we're expecting to see more federal and state climate and energy incentives. So in Japan, as I mentioned, again, new prime minister, upcoming elections, both at the local level, both countries looking at siting and employment challenges, but also opportunities with these new technologies emerging. And then in Japan, again, I mentioned the land use restrictions for solar, but also some local opposition and local support in different places for new nuclear construction. So that's been kind of an ambiguous issue because as the seventh basic energy plan is being discussed, there are some communities that are supportive of having new construction and some that are opposed. And so that issue has become something that I think they're deciding how to address in the next plan. Okay, so that brings me to my final point on cooperation prospects. And I tried to do this from a Trump versus Harris perspective so that we understand what our options are, right? Okay, so if we look at hydrogen, the Trump administration would be supportive of a blue hydrogen or a purple hydrogen discussion. So hydrogen from natural gas, hydrogen from nuclear. A Harris administration would be happy to have a conversation about collaboration on both of those, but also green hydrogen. So the collaboration opportunities would be expanded because we'd be talking about renewables production, but you've heard about some of the challenges from my colleagues who spoke already. For nuclear fission and fusion, we already have collaboration happening, and that would, I expect, continue under both administrations, but probably differently because of the perspective that that a Trump administration might have on imports, on sharing of technologies and sharing of ideas. But there could potentially be collaboration with either one. Natural gas, same thing. We expect to see promotion under both. So there's an opportunity for a collaboration there. Critical minerals, clearly under a Harris administration, there would be collaboration, and there already has been under this administration. But the Trump administration, from a mining and critical resource standpoint, not from a renewable standpoint, would potentially be interested in this as well. And with the support of companies like Tesla and Elon Musk, there might be some movement in that area as well. And then for CCS or CCUS, continuation of collaboration under both. Hydropower, I expect the Harris administration would be happy to collaborate on hydropower in any capacity. Trump administration would be focused on large hydropower, large dams, and not necessarily the smaller hydropower that's considered renewable. Offshore wind, we've all heard a big no from any Trump platform on wind, but Harris administration, yes. So there would be continued collaboration there. Geothermal is kind of uncertain for a Trump administration. I will explain why. Would be supported by Harris administration if we were to have, we would be continuing collaboration there. From a Trump administration perspective, geothermal sounds renewable, right? So probably no. However, The technology is very similar to fracking. So I expect that that could be an avenue of discussion if there were a Trump administration because the technology is similar. And then for solar, Harris administration, yes. Trump administration, a couple of years ago, I would have said no, absolutely not. However, again, with Elon Musk's support, there is a possibility that some sort of discussion of solar might happen because they have the solar roof. Tesla has produced a solar roof. They also have other solar technologies and battery storage technologies that they produce. So again, that's why I put possible for the Trump administration in terms of collaboration with Japan on battery storage. And then Harris administration would be a yes. So that is all I wanted to share with you for now, but I look forward to the discussion and your questions. If anyone happens to be interested, I put my book there so you can check it out. And if anyone has feedback for me, I would welcome that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. You provided really great to me for an interesting jumping off point for our discussion now. Of course, the overall picture throughout, I like to say three efficiency, development world, also the surveillance. It's a separate object. Which, especially beginning in places like India, is something of primary income support. In talking about the way Jennifer said, stimulated a lot of important thoughts. I wonder some of the others to begin with might more look, maybe beginning with the latest of those that you talked about, battery storage, because it's so fundamental in transformation. The ability to store, I mean, the wind isn't always blowing and the sun isn't always shining. And if you're talking transition, of course, implicitly a lot of the discussion on transition, I think I heard from our Japanese participants, was suggesting that nuclear really is pretty much the beginning, almost the beginning of the end. Not that that is not important. I think all of us would agree. But on this question of battery storage in the EV transition, it's important. Various kinds of alternatives, it's terribly important. There's some capabilities that both countries have. Their political concerns. It's a terribly important question in the future. So we can start with that and then go on to other areas of US-Japan potential cooperation, what kinds of difference they might make in the world. You know, I don't know, but that technical side. Chris, you talked about batteries a little. Yeah, so start us off there. Energy storage at the grid scale. That's really what we're talking about when we say sun not shining, wind not blowing. It's not the EVs that are going to go with it, unless we talk about vehicle to grid, which is also a nascent technology, but certainly one that can advance a lot more quickly than some of these others. But really, it's on this to zero sum. So as I mentioned in my talk, you're going to have this residual demand for thermal power, as long as battery energy storage is enough economic parity in terms of communicating next to your renewable project. So that enables you to have that grid reliability that I mentioned and constant dispatchable power even when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And so that's why a centerpiece of my presentation, at least for that transitional period of the 2020s and the 2030s, really also having a lot of switching on as quickly as anticipated in Japan. And that's also causing coal to stick a little bit more on the power supply stack.
simply because of the grid reliability issue. You do want 24/7 delivery of economically, politically, socially incentives. And so then it's going to be focal. And really it is a zero sum. So as we advance both at the national land level here in the United States as well as scaling it up with company investment, the IRA did go a long way in benefiting battery and energy storage. And I think that financing and potentially the Japanese participation in US-based projects and batteries could certainly benefit from the knowledge transfer point of view, but also just benefiting from the transition in the United States and being able to take can be applied to Japan, switch it over to Japan. That is really going to be what drives the evolution of thermal fossil fuel power. For the most part, and that's not the Japanese specific tail, that is a global tail that we're really trying to reduce those costs. As I said previously, the EVs are sucking up a lot of the battery technologies, and somewhat depriving the grid scale projects to really scale up as quickly because EVs are really exploding. And that being said, we're also potentially see how the politics, particularly in trade, of what people are pointing to an overcapacity in China. You have less trade tensions and you access some of those cheaper inputs, you could see battery storage scale more quickly. That being said, particularly with their sort of
was shut down for a short two. Think about that.
But the battery also was more dominated by the Chinese company. So we are very much aware of that. But for the battery, how to control it, software or the computing programming is more important than the machinery itself. So we feel that if we can actually control that, coming to the point of Chris pointed out in presentation that we have been expecting the energy or electricity demand to come down into the future, and we plan everything around that. So the sixth basic energy strategy for Japan, which is ongoing currently, the ongoing discussion is to revise that. But we have been thinking, we have planned everything based on the assumption that the electricity demand would be more efficient and then safe. But now we are expecting opposite. It's going to be growing, but we don't know how much it will grow. That's one point. Secondly, it's the electric is actually surging in the other city area, especially Tokyo and Osaka, because of the data centers which we talked about. That's one thing. So that is the distribution is actually not there. Battery storage, it can store electricity only for a few hours, up to even the maximum 1 day probably, or days. So it won't go beyond the several days, over weeks. And therefore, we have been looking forward to develop the technologies of hydrogen because it can store electricity in a different form. So all these are intended future plans are good. And then we get to know how much into the Japanese market is actually welcome because we are feeling that we
The influence of larger scale corporations, in particular, the role of China in relationship to for battery storage. Now, personally, in Ishii-san's remarks, in particular, he talked about several pieces of recent legislation in Japan. He mentioned May of 2024, hydrogen, CCS, and offshore wind. But if I recall correctly, and that takes us to different areas of the energy equation, energy environment. I mean, CCS, for example, somehow reducing the storage, capture and storage. Could you elaborate a little on what difference they make from a broader point of view? And I don't know, Jennifer, you must have been following those things too.
I'm nodding because I think you didn't get to offshore wind. You talked a little bit about the hydrogen and the CCS, but I wanted to hear about offshore wind.
Right. I wasn't draft that offshore wind. Yes.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little on some of these policy innovations in Japan and what difference they make from a broader point of view?
So my point of view, hydrogen is important for to achieve carbon neutrality in the country. So also we focus on every pathway to achieve carbon neutrality. Hydrogen, ammonia, CCS, renewable energy such as wind power, solar, and we have to decarbonize electricity. So which means in terms of that. We have to recognize necessity to be a power also. Yes. So this is my opinion.
See,
May I add one point?
Please,
on the
yeah.
hydrogen? Well, Japan is known to be promoting hydrogen and development of hydrogen, but everybody is actually looking around, where is the market? Who is going to make use of the hydrogen? And in Japan actually was not, how to say, exception. We didn't have any preparation for the receiving the hydrogen. Like, we talk about the supply chain, but we are only concentrating on which hydrogen is more cost effective because we have to transport that from the very far away. But how to receive it and how to distribute within Japan has never been discussed, and it has never been supported by the political programs. So that is one of them, which is supported by this new act. And then another thing is because hydrogen is very expensive, how to subsidize the initial cost of a high hydrogen by the difference between the hydrogen and the natural gas will actually the substitute. Hydrogen is substituted. So that is becoming possible. That was the very important point about the hydrogen promotion.
yeah, please.
So I think one of the things, because we talked about this before, all of us were talking about not today, but yesterday, this idea that even if we fix the supply side, the demand side, the market side isn't always addressed by the policy legislation that's coming through, and that's in either country. So we have the same set of challenges, particularly for hydrogen, and so that consideration of the whole life cycle of these technologies needs to be addressed. If we're talking about incentives, we need to be thinking about the incentives, not to say that we should be paying people to use the technology if they don't want to use it, but that we have to think about where that market is. And it's very difficult because if the market isn't there, we don't have the investment in the supply. But if we don't have the investment in the supply, the consumers are nervous. So it makes it very challenging. One quick thing I just wanted to add on the offshore wind is this amendment to the Marine Energy Resources Act from this year was supposed to enable offshore wind to be developed in the EEZ, the exclusive economic zones. So that's what I was curious about from JOGMEC's perspective, to hear a little bit more about that.
Very interesting question. Japan, of course, has the 6th largest EEZs in the world. And so there's a lot of potential there.
In terms of Hydrogen Promotion Act, so we not only focus on the supplier side, but also demand side.
Yes.
So we will provide a subsidy to the approved project to demand side.
Yeah, it's a great solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's Japanese industrial policy. It's often looked at both the demand and the supply side in a more holistic way than I guess has sometimes been the case in US policy.
I think, sorry,
Yeah,
Japan and Europe are unfortunately the exceptions and not the rule. As he said previously, globally policies focus on supply. And actually right now, JERA has announced an intention to invest, but they have not yet in the Baytown ExxonMobil Blue Hydrogen project. It's slipping a bit. It was supposed to achieve FID by the end of this year. Exxon is saying now FID, final investment decision, which is the point at which you certainly go forward with your investment and the construction of the project. The real problem for CCS and hydrogen generally, both blue, so created by fossil fuel and then abated, and green, is that the costs are prohibitive compared to current fuel sources. And so you need, the other wrinkle is you need solid policies that provide financial incentives. Exxon has said time and again that they need to qualify for 45V, which is the hydrogen supporting provisions within the IRA, or the project won't be nearly as profitable for them and their partners, and probably won't get off the ground or have multiple phases to it. And so you really do need that solid policy, financial incentive as well as regulation, so carrots as well as sticks, to really bring costs down, make these projects at least in the black instead of in the red, so that they can proceed from the drawing board to actual construction on site. But it'll be very telling over the next couple of years where CCS and hydrogen economics go in particular, with the support of both the supply side and demand side, so you can get clarity from both sides, because without a market, the project developers aren't investing. And without the project developers investing, nobody wants to create a market. And so that's kind of where we are right now.
In other words, a holistic sort of look becomes quite important in both the supply and the demand side. And well, historically, the US has often not looked as holistically as Japan. But, you know, I'm with Gina Raimondo and so on. I mean, we do see some sense of, you know, more holistic approaches that may be in the works. We do want in just a moment to open the floor up for questions and comments that people have. But there's one or two important issues that Yamashita-san and Ishii-san raised in particular. I think we should at least highlight and note. The one, energy efficiency, the role of the things that need to be done in developing countries. The one that really strikes me is, of course, the most populous nation in the world, India now. And it's this, you know, relative slowness, a rapid rate of growth, at global emissions, of course, continuing at very rapid rates. Like the question would be, what can be done, or what should be done, or what is Japan doing particularly under, and how can the US and Japan cooperate to encourage the large developing countries to improve their greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce their emissions, and promote energy efficiency in other ways? You want to elaborate on that? So much to son, or either of the two of you.
So I want to focus on Southeast Asia countries. Sure. So yes, so as I showed before, so the generation mix of South Asian countries is mainly coal and natural gas. So in order to transfer coal power plants to gas plant to achieve transition carbon neutrality, so United States can export LNG to South Asian countries. And these countries can use Japan's technology. So we, Japan, US, can collaborate focus on South Asian countries.
As I said in my presentation, both countries do have very solid energy efficiency improvement programs in every sector, especially for the appliances and then also for the building sector, which are difficult to tackle unless you have a regulation. Even if you have the standard, it won't actually be spread in the market and consumers won't buy it. So you have to actually deal with the retailers and all these, the downstream part of the market. So we work in collaboration with the retailers also. We try to expel the inefficient products out of the market. And then if the retailers explain fully to the consumers what is the good point about this product, that product, this appliance, this appliance. As you are familiar in Japanese market, there are so many different kinds of products on one line, like a hair dryer. You can choose from product A to product Z. So the retailers have to understand which product is more efficient, etc. But together with the regulation that the inefficient products have to be expelled. And then all these are explained in the post, how much the electricity tariff will be saved over time, etc. So this whole package is there as a model case of the regulation and standard combined together. So that kind of program existing not only in Japan but also in the United States. And then I believe that if we collaborate together and then we'll try to transfer that kind of ideas and programs into the market in ASEAN, that will be very effective. But so far we haven't been collaborating in that area too much. Just a little bit in China, maybe a little bit in the one or two ASEAN countries, but never working together. So it is one sphere which we can explore.
I see, very interesting, a new area for US-Japan collaboration. Well, a lot of issues out there. To summarize this, I mean, we can't really summarize totally, but I'm struck by some new policy innovations in Japan. A special role on efficiency and in the hydrogen, some emphasis in the hydrogen area. A lot of people from directly, we discussed nuclear. It sounds like, especially given the very rapid increase in demand because of the, AI and so on, and EVs, and the slow pace and complexities of battery development and renewables, that there's a big role, has to be, for nuclear in the future. Those are just a few thoughts. I know there's also a lot of people who are quite knowledgeable here, beginning with those right in front of us, so many from the energy institutes and so on. So the floor is open. We have about another 10, 15 minutes. Yes, please, Toyoda-san.
Thank you very much for wonderful presentation. Particularly, I like Jennifer-san comparative analysis and everything in Japan. It's really nice. Two questions, if I may. One is about energy efficiency. Everybody is trying to make energy efficiency But some European countries introduced regulation for promoting energy savings. And I think one of the regulation is rather indirect regulation. Suppliers, gas company or power company have duty to reduce, say, 10% or 50% energy conservation. And what they are trying to do is to consult with consumers or company or ordinary people, but they can somehow explain what you can do. So it's direct, indirect regulation, but I think as far as the companies are concerned, direct regulation, you have to reduce 10%, 20%. Well, particularly I think as far as Japan is concerned, we had encouraged a lot of voluntary efforts, but it's hitting the ceiling or the limit. And so maybe it's time for us to introduce some sort of indirect regulation. That's a question. Number one. Number two, it's more. We like to ask U.S. To help Japan with respect to nuclear regulations. I think we used to have 54 plants before the accident. And we think 36 plants can be utilized, but still we have only 12 plants can be deorganized or deoperated. I think that is one of the problem of regulation. In Japan, they are proud. The council or regulatory council is prouding over how strict the regulation is, but it's not the strictness of the regulation. I think the challenge for us is what is optimized regulation, and probably US can help Japan to teach what is the optimization of regulation. What do you think? This is quite important. I think as far as Japan is concerned, the stricter the better. But actually, it doesn't work. So if anybody can explain to us your
Thank you.
help. That's one.
I have a comment on the second question in particular. I'm sure others will have more expert comments on the first question than I do. I have some thoughts, but one of the things I had discussed with many people in Japan over the past years is probabilistic risk assessment, PRA. And
Yeah.
we almost don't even need to do that in the US because we don't have zero risk tolerance.
Right.
But in Japan, there is zero risk tolerance. And therefore, any chance of risk becomes a concern. And now we see it with solar, right? Where there was a landslide and there were problems with solar panels. So now there are communities opposing solar for that reason. And it's understandable. Of course, communities want to be safe. They want the environment to be safe. And they want their health to be protected. But at the same time, really, these companies cannot guarantee zero risk.
Right.
Zero is impossible, right? So I think the discussion on the regulations has to be framed in that way of this idea of the optimization that Toyoda-san mentioned, but also probabilistic risk assessment. So are we being transparent about what the risks are and then how we would address those? So not just saying we won't have any risk, which has been a problem in Japan, because then it encourages the communities to support the projects because they think there's zero risk when that isn't true. So acknowledgement of the risks, but helping communities to understand the trade-offs and the potential for those risks, but also what will be done if something were to happen. Because often I think the perception is we can just say that we're going to prevent the risk, but if that's not possible, you have to have a plan on the other side, right? You have to have a plan for what will we do if a landslide happens? What will we do if there is a reactor breach? How do we contain those? And what is the potential for risk once we've done that. And we had a similar problem in the US with 3 Mile Island. I mean, there was for decades, everybody was afraid of nuclear power also, although it was contained, the accident was contained. So I think the cultural aspect is one challenge for the US and Japan in trying to share lessons, because the government can share lessons and the utilities can share lessons. But if the public doesn't buy into those lessons or accept those realities, then it's just more challenging. So I think having discussions about community level engagement is needed also, not just the government level discussions.
Well, thank you. It's very important. And so maybe you could just add optimization of mitigation in your list. That's wonderful. And I invite Jennifer.
Any other comments?
I have just a follow-on. It's funny that you mentioned 3 Mile Island. I don't know if any of you saw that Microsoft is actually going to start up a reactor from 3 Mile Island to power some of the data centers. Our team does not think that's replicable to most other reactors in the United States that have been shut off. A lot of the potential for cooperation and something that really needs a lot more support from the policy standpoint. The IRA supports currently operating traditional nuclear technologies, but I think firms like TerraPower, Bill Gates, his startup in the nuclear space, there are some enticing technologies for SMRs that in the medium to long term from a technology standpoint, Dr. Skluter also touched on a different topic that's really starting to hamper the advancement of certain CCS projects in the United States. It's local opposition. Whether even you convey the risks, whether they believe what you're saying even is an issue in the United States. So you're seeing a lot more projects stopped at the early and late development stages, and a growing proportion being due to local opposition. And so maybe brainstorming or collaborating on what has worked and sort of delivering your message of what the risks are, what's an acceptable level of risk to that population, be it local or national, that will also be crucial. It's not just, the permitting of larger reactors, but advancing technology and local opposition.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there are any further last comments.
I think on the energy efficiency.
On the other questions.
Yes, I know. But I also wanted to say something about nuclear. In Japan, because we are facing decreasing population and number of the youngsters are decreasing very drastically, and then we have to have a nice young engineers into the nuclear world. Therefore, the collaboration with other countries is very much welcome, but especially in the sense that the youngsters to discuss, face to face about the importance of these other options than nuclear, especially nuclear. And then the youngsters may get interested in why the Microsoft has come up with the idea of using nuclear, etc. That might be very inviting. That's one thing I'm saying. And Toyoda-san's question was very difficult. I was not aware of this scheme, the company, to advise the consumers on the electricity saving method. I am aware that they have been doing that in the summer, every summer so far, because of the shortage of electricity, because of the fear for the shortage of electricity. So they know which one, they are the only ones who know the load curve, which demand is high, when and which day and at what time. So they are the good advisors to give us. So what would be the benefit for them? To minimize the cost of investment, so that they know that consumers will react to their advice, and then they will save their electricity, or they use their electricity wisely and according to the power supply. That will be also called as a demand response. Yes. So the maximum utilize of the demand response in collaboration with the power company is one thing. For that, they have to change the tariff scheme because currently the Japanese companies most of the Japanese companies are encouraging consumers to use electricity in overnight because this is the cheapest. But they have to make it a little bit shift so that they will invite consumers to use electricity more during the day where the solar power is available.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Ishii-san, any very, very last words? Very quickly.
Yes, a nuclear regulation, it is super hard question for me. So in Japan, as you know, so nuclear power regulation is made only by Nuclear Regulation Authority. So as a Japanese department, Japanese government can't make any comment for that. And even so, Prime Minister. So it's so bad.
Well, a lot of issues still unresolved. We have just a very, very brief transition break now, but thank you. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you. Just very brief break.
All right. See you. How have you been?
Good, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Okay, Mr. 12:30, right?
Because even if we don't. With the interest, just how.
Hey, how are you? Great to see you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to meet you.
Maybe we'll have one. So you
Yeah, or like this kind of thing.
yeah.
Do research.
And the client's like, he'll be growing. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. So yeah, one thing that we didn't really get into is.
I'm sorry.
What happens when Chinese demand? Also to
We see the percent increase to 28.
Sure.
But they want to peak out emission to 30.
Yeah.
So
These are probably like.
if demand isn't resilient globally, we probably see more opportunities to convert infrastructure because the demand for LNG is so
Okay,
high. The real low hanging fruit would be in the midstream. So natural gas pipelines, those can be
And also, like, in terms of hydrogen, like, one thing
I should have did the
Yeah, right. Sure. I guess they could be easy. Okay.
they're compressing the gases, CO2 or
Yeah.
NH4 or whatever, yeah. That you can definitely use the compressor.
Maybe like. Justify.
So reduction
As a transport way.
I don't know, transition.
Yes.
So technology.
You still need to build the chargers in our province. I think the 10 will execute that much more efficiently. She's been stranded for 6 hours charging her car. So she has a Nissan and the charger was for a Tesla. So it's forever and got stuck in her car. So she had to like. So.
I wanted to give you my card.
Yeah.
Basically, it's already based in you.
Ron does that mistake. I'm in New York. I'll be back to teach his class in the. I'll be happy to look you up. Like a rail or a coffee.
Yeah, let's look at that. Because we're doing more work.
I mean, in terms of the transition, we didn't have with control of capacity pretty much across the board. Thank you so much.
Oh, you see down.
We're in Canada. I mean, it's.
Everybody,
Until we have carbon credits, yes,
we are starting up our next session.
you need a reward for that. Definitely reach out. Thank you.
Well, it's always a difficult thing to understand that. Yes. Yeah. That's great. Did I hold this? Okay, thank you. No problem. All right, I'm going to start session 2, international order, power versus rules. It's a trade policy issue. We are going to discuss tariff order, significance and implication to the international economy, digital trade, international economic order, etc., etc. We learned a lot from the session 1. We are living in a really complicated world with rising geopolitical risk. It's added another challenge to the energy policy. It's always pursuing 3E: growth and economic growth, energy security, and environment. Trade policy is likewise facing with very serious geopolitical risk. That's complicating the picture as a whole picture of the trade policy. We are going to have 4 distinguished speakers for this session, as you can notice from the book. I would like to change the order of the speech
slightly because we are allied countries and we are friends. I don't think we can make a distinction between the country, the nationality. So first speaker is I would put Ambassador Kenneth Juster, former ambassador to India. He was a deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs. So he's a trade policy expert. He can talk about many the interesting issues, including the change of the U.S. administration. What could impact on the trade policy? That's everybody is interested in. And after that, I'm going to invite Dr. Kenta Hirami, associate professor, University of Nagasaki. He's young but very brilliant, distinguished expert on international trade law. So he's a lawyer, and he's going to talk about the danger of unilateralism. And thirdly, Ambassador David Shea just arrived with us, and he's former ambassador to Vietnam, principal deputy undersecretary of defense policy. So he's an expert on national security. And in particular today, for our interest, he's going to talk about geoeconomics. And after that, we have a very distinguished business representative from Keidanren, USA. Keidanren Japanese Business Industry Association has office in Washington, D.C., and he's the head of this office. And he's been quite knowledgeable about Japanese business responding to the challenges of the geopolitical risk. So we have a very distinguished people here, and look forward to a good discussion on trade policy issues. So having said so, we will start discussion. And first, the part of presentation. As I said, first speaker is Ambassador Juster. Please, you have floor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to discuss this morning the evolving architecture of the world trade system and the impact that the U.S. presidential election may have on that trading system. As you'll see in my presentation, the rules-based system has evolved from its origins after World War II and was mostly moving in a very positive direction of increased globalization and trade through the formation of the World Trade Organization and the entrance to China into the WTO in 2001. But in more recent years, we have seen a growing protectionism, especially among the two leading economies, the United States and China. And I'll speak about that and then what may be the impact of the U.S. presidential election. International trade patterns have changed dramatically since World War II, with several key milestones along the way. As countries recovered after World War II, they recognized that the new economic order and a set of trade arrangements were needed. And this was especially the case because the United States sought to develop new markets for its own growth and to open its domestic markets to help the recovering economies of its allies and partners. Accordingly, in 1947, 23 countries, which at the time represented about 1/2 of the world's trade, signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which established a rules-based system focused on lowering tariffs. Trade patterns changed dramatically after the signing of the GATT, with exports growing even faster than the global economy at a rate about 8% per year from 1950 to 1973. And Asian countries represented an ever-growing share of world trade. And as people in this room know well, Japan saw substantial growth through an export-oriented strategy, becoming the second largest economy in the market economy in 1968. And the rise of the four Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, also followed a similar strategy. Now, a second upswing in trade liberalization began in the mid-1980s, mid to late 1980s, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union disintegrating. In 1993, the European Union sought to rejuvenate European economies by launching a single market and gradually integrating the economies of Central and Eastern Europe. There were also efforts at North American integration. And in 1994, we saw Mexico joining the United States and Canada, who had signed a free trade agreement in 1987 to form the North American Free Trade Association, known as NAFTA. These regional integration efforts in Europe and North America also spurred the Asian countries to start thinking about their own regional and bilateral agreements. I would say that the next phase of the world trade system came in 1994, when now 123 members of GATT created the World Trade Organization. This marked a significant transformation of the multilateral trading system to creating a permanent organization. The GATT was just signatories, but not a permanent body, which was created with the WTO. And there were developments in other areas as well, including a system for resolving disputes. And the WTO was going to govern international trade in goods, as well as other areas such as services and intellectual property. Increasingly ambitious negotiations followed, notably with the 2001 Doha Development Round, seeking to converge complex interests of many developing and developed countries into a single package of outcomes covering a range of topics. However, because of the consensus principle in the WTO, the negotiations stalled and there could not be agreement reached among the diverse membership of the WTO. China also became a member of the WTO in 2001 and declared itself a developing economy. Over time, however, China failed to implement commitments in key areas, even as it emerged as a major exporter. The WTO's dispute resolution system also has faltered in recent years. As the global trading system has evolved, WTO members filed increasingly complex cases, and a lack of updated rules has led to complaints of judicial overreach, of decisions going beyond the narrow dispute that they were addressing and enunciating broader principles. In 2014, the WTO members started to reach plurilateral agreements because they were unable to reach consensus agreements, and therefore they reached a plurilateral agreement on where they reached a trade facilitation agreement, which made rules easier and more efficient. It was actually a broad WTO agreement. And there are currently today 164 members of the WTO, and their economies account for 98% of global trade. And as I said, there have been successes such as the Trade Facilitation Agreement in 2014, but the consensus principle has prevented WTO members from making progress in many areas. And as a result, due to this inability to reach full consensus, members have turned to plurilateral agreements, agreements that are among a smaller group of members that any WTO member can voluntarily join if they agree to the content of the plurilateral agreement. One example is the agreement on government procurement, which was last amended in 2012. Now, plurilateral agreements can also be reached outside of the WTO framework, and we've seen that in Asia, where there are two regional agreements. One is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that has 15 Asian countries in it and was concluded in 2019 and 2020. And the other is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had begun as just the TPP, and I'll get into this in a second, became the CPTPP. Japan is a party to both of these regional agreements. The United States had been a leader in negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which in many respects evolved into a de facto Japan-U.S. free trade agreement because they were the two key parties in it. But the U.S. Under President Trump abruptly withdrew on his first day in office, even though no one on the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, was aware that this was taking place until after it had occurred. A quick story on this. I was in the White House at the time, and I met with Ambassador Ken Sasai, who was Japan's ambassador to the United States, and urged him to have Japan try to hold the agreement together among the other 11 countries with the thought that the next U.S. administration would join the agreement. Well, the first part of my discussion was successful, and Japan did a great job in pulling the other 10 countries together to form a new agreement, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which actually suspended 22 provisions which had been priorities primarily of the United States. But unfortunately, I was wrong about the trade policy of the next administration. The Biden administration, in many respects, has continued the trade policy of the Trump administration. And what's happened is that the U.S. perception of the rules-based international system has changed greatly for several reasons, including the trade practices followed by China, including widespread dumping of goods, illegal subsidies, the stealing of intellectual property, and the resulting hollowing out of the U.S. manufacturing sector. Also, the effects of COVID-19 have exposed supply chains and other vulnerabilities in critical sectors. And then finally, sort of the rise of populism. In addition, in the United States, there have been frustrations with the WTO system. One that I already mentioned was the consensus principle, which became an obstacle in reaching new agreements or making reforms to the WTO system. Second, from the perspective of the United States, is a lack of fairness in tariff rates. What happens when you enter the WTO, you negotiate a bound tariff rate, which is the highest rate you can go to. And many countries have high rates, and there's no provision for them lowering those rates over time, whereas the United States has a very low bound rate because when they began the system, they were encouraging other countries to grow by exporting to the U.S. markets. But now the U.S. finds itself with a very low rate and other countries with higher rates, and there's no way to adjust it. And so there's a sense of a lack of reciprocity. Third, from the U.S. perspective, the dispute resolution or dispute settlement function is not working effectively, especially the appellate body, which takes too long to make decisions and whose decisions are felt to be too broad in effect. Regrettably, however, the United States has effectively disabled the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism by blocking judicial appointments to the appellate body, which is a group of 7 judges that hears appeals regarding WTO rulings. As a result, any country on a punitive end of a WTO ruling can simply appeal it and delay its enforcement indefinitely because there's no body to hear the appeal. This has come to be known as appealing into the void. It's a rather unfortunate situation. These problems eventually led the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in April of 2023 to deliver a critique in Foreign Policy magazine, or no, excuse me, he gave a speech. He gave a speech, a major speech delivering a critique of the neoliberal consensus that has served as the foundation of the international economic system and policy for nearly a century, for 80 years. And he indicated that the United States was moving away from an agenda of globalization and trade liberalization. And instead, the current administration has embraced a policy of selectively raising tariffs, of increasing restrictions on inward and outbound foreign investment, of imposing new export controls on technology items, of engaging in domestic industrial policy, and of tightening antitrust enforcement. In fact, we're seeing now the stated objection by the administration and by the Trump and Vance team as well to the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel, which in my opinion makes no sense to oppose, but is being done so on claims of potentially antitrust and foreign investment being a security issue. Rulings have not been concluded, and that may happen after the election. But all of these new tools are now being used, although not with a completely clear systematic sense as to when they'll be invoked. So the rules-based economic system, while imperfect and in need of updating, has offered over the years predictability and stability, with most countries following most of the rules most of the time. But now the two largest economies are acting against the trading rules. China has broken the rules repeatedly, while the United States is using a national security lens to promote protectionism and industrial policy. And that's occurred in the last two administrations. Regrettably, the conduct of China and the United States also weakens the incentives of other states to abide by and maintain the WTO order, because without the WTO's parameters, there's little in place to check protectionist impulses. Thus, while trade remains central to the growth of developing economies, big multilateral agreements are simply not going to happen at this time, nor are we likely to see what are called full scope FTAs, completely comprehensive free trade agreements. Instead, we're seeing smaller sectoral agreements. There was a recent agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability by New Zealand, Costa Rica, Switzerland, and Iceland. The United States and Japan have a digital trade agreement, which they signed in 2020. Japan, Australia, and Singapore also were co-conveners of a WTO plurilateral agreement, joint statement initiative on e-commerce, although the United States withdrew from that. The United States and Japan have a critical minerals agreement they signed in 2022. We may see something in the future on semiconductors and other potential targeted bilateral agreements. Recognizing that it needs some sort of strategy, economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, and amid concerns that the United States lacked a robust trade agenda after withdrawing from the TPP, the Biden administration launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IPEF, in May 2022, which includes 13 other countries. And there were 4 pillars. 3 have been concluded, one on supply chain agreement, secondly, a clean economy agreement, which relates to clean energy and climate-friendly technologies. Third, a fair economy agreement on corruption, tax evasion, and transparency. These are more commitments to certain principles. These are not market opening agreements. And the 4th pillar, which related to trade, took market access off the table, and there's been no trade agreement yet at this time. And the United States also, during the discussions on trade, suspended its own digital trade talks because it felt it needed to consider policy further internally. So let me conclude by looking forward to what might happen after the election. Unfortunately, I don't expect the election results to change any of these major trends. U.S. politicians now view trade policy and industrial policy largely as a zero-sum game. Neither Vice President Harris nor former President Trump seems to be interested in genuine FTAs of a full-scope nature. And the United States, regrettably, may also be on the sidelines for a very important standard setting by not being part of these agreements. Both Harris and Trump share the overall position that China has not played fair on trade and intellectual property issues, and both have the objective of bringing manufacturing back to the United States and making more products here. But they may differ on some of their tactics. If Vice President Harris were to win, she would likely have a limited trade agenda with little change from the Biden approach. She would probably continue the Biden policy of tariffs and export controls in a targeted fashion, where she felt there was a security concern or a detrimental impact on American companies and the U.S. economy. She would focus on what she wants made in the United States, such as electric vehicles, batteries, and chips. And there would also be a focus on supply chain resilience and an emphasis on working with allies and partners to address this challenge. In addition, she would likely be interested in the nexus between climate and sustainability on the one hand and trade on the other. Now, former President Trump is predictably unpredictable. He tries to create negotiating leverage, and he may shake things up to do some form of trade deals. He would likely be more active in the trade arena than Vice President Harris. He is a tariff man, but he is also a deal maker. He wants to open markets for U.S. companies. He stated that he wants a 20% tariff across the board and a 60% tariff on top of that for China. But this is his opening position. He may want strategic decoupling and protection for the U.S. market. He may also want to pressure Beijing to get back to the negotiating table to cut a deal to open Chinese markets, something that Vice President Harris probably doesn't have in mind. And even for his 20% across the board tariffs, I think he would expect retaliatory tariffs at the outset, but then again may use this as a way for leverage and negotiating some limited openings for American companies. So let me stop there. It's not an overly optimistic picture, but it's unfortunately the reality we're dealing with today. Thank you.
Well, maybe I have my personal concern is future of WTO dispute settlement mechanism. What is the future of appellate body? But anyway, question is maybe sometime later. So I would like to ask Professor Hirami, next speaker. Could you please observe 10 minutes time limit? Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to give my presentation today. My name is Kenta Hirami, Associate Professor of International Law, University of Nagasaki, Japan. In my presentation, I'd like to focus on the rise of unilateralism in the field of trade. I think the rise of unilateralism reflects the tension between power and rule in international economic relations today. I will talk about what is unilateralism, why unilateralism is reviving today, and the problematic nature of unilateral measures, and finally, how unilateralism should be controlled. First, I address what is unilateralism. As you know, there is no agreed definition of unilateralism, and this term is often used in two senses. As shown in this slide, The first is juridical unilateral acts. This action does not raise legal issues. What is at issue now in the field of trade is the second sense. Second is the general tendency prevailing among some powerful states to act unilaterally to impose their values on other states. To explain in detail, in the field of trade, to achieve some policy objectives such as fight for climate change and the protection of labor rights, states with large markets have increasingly taken unilateral measures to condition market access by imposing direct liability on economic actors in other states that wish to trade. Here are examples of unilateral measures. As for the United States, the US unilateral measures include Helms-Burton Act. This is an old example, but most problematic one. And the Section 301 of the Trade Act, this is a well-known example. Under the US-China friction, the Section 301 is being actively used again today. As for the European Union, the EU is more actively using unilateralism than the United States. CBAM, EU battery regulation, corporate sustainability due diligence directive, so-called CSDDD, and EU deforestation regulation, EUDR. These EU regulatory measures have so-called Brussels effect, meaning unilateral regulatory globalization. There are at least 3 reasons for the rise of unilateralism today. First, the ineffectiveness of existing international rules for today's social issues, such as the protection of environment and human rights and economic security challenges. Second, despite this ineffectiveness of existing rules, new rule-making by international treaties has stalled. In other words, the stagnation of new rule-making. Third, WTO appellate body crisis has resulted in the partial paralysis of the dispute settlement system. Under these circumstances, unilateral measures imposing conditions on market access are more likely to be effective tools to change the behavior of other states or its economic actors. This statement at the US-EU TTC is a clear example of the US and EU preferences for unilateralism today. Next, I'd like to point out 3 problems with unilateralism. First, unilateral measures often impose one community's values to other communities. This can be especially contentious where other states does not consent to measures at issue. So unilateral measures often resulted in value conflicts among states. Second, the imposition of economic costs and administrative burdens on economic actors in other states is also problematic. As I mentioned earlier, EU regulatory measures such as CBAM have been criticized in this regard. Third, unilateralism may deny other states regulatory autonomy to take other means for same policy objectives. This means the constraints on the regulatory space of other states. So the issue to be considered is how to mitigate negative impacts of unilateralism. Here, I focus only on the first practical approach. The use of dispute settlement system in trade agreements seem to be the most common way to deal with problematic unilateral measures. But I already mentioned the dysfunction of WTO dispute settlement system, and also the use of dispute settlement system between like-minded the use of dispute settlement system between like-minded countries is undesirable in the current international situations. So, in my view, economic diplomacy becomes important. A routine dialogue between governments could contribute to mitigate value conflicts that unilateral measures may cause. In addition, the role of private sector is also important. Private sector's participation in the decision-making process of a state imposing unilateral measures through lobbying and so on may contribute to reflecting private sector's concerns in the design of unilateral measures. In this way, I think if both public and private sectors deal with the rise of unilateralism in their own ways, it will contribute to mitigating the negative impact of unilateralism to a certain degree. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
I was interested in, social issues also rising in the trade policy as well. I think, human rights diligence and labor standards, such social issues, of course, a very important issue like economic security. But maybe on those issues could be handled in another international forum. But anyway, if we have time, we would like to discuss further on that aspect. Having said so, the third speaker is, as I told you, Ambassador David Shea, former ambassador to Vietnam and expert on defense national security issue. So please, you have floor. If you don't mind, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Haraoka, and thanks to JEF for your support to the Reischauer Center in conducting this event. I'd like to provide an optimistic counterpart to the previous speakers, but I can't. I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on trade, but I know a thing or two about geopolitics, and I believe that a lack of attention to regional economic policy in the Indo-Pacific region will have a strongly negative long-term effect on our geopolitical strategy. When I went to Vietnam as ambassador in 2011, one of my assignments was to get Vietnam to join negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The economic benefits to Vietnam were pretty clear from the start. In fact, the Peterson Institute had produced a study indicating that Vietnam would be the TPP member to benefit most from the agreement in economic terms. I pitched this to the Vietnamese as part of my assignment, but I also made an argument based not only on the economic benefits to Vietnam of TPP membership, I also made an argument on geopolitical grounds. As a member of TPP, Vietnam could further diversify its trading relationships and increase its room for maneuver in the region without having to accommodate itself wholly to Chinese economic interests. The Vietnamese, of course, understood this immediately. I think they understood it faster than Washington did. And I believe this way of thinking contributed to their decision to join TPP talks in 2013. I think this demonstrates the strong link between geopolitics and international economic policy. A Vietnam made strong, prosperous, and independent, partly by membership in TPP, would be able to pursue its geopolitical and geoeconomic interests much more vigorously, particularly vis-a-vis China. I saw all of these goals as interlinked. Progress in one area would lead to progress in others. And in this regard, I use TPP talks as a way of leveraging my human rights agenda, and it worked. During the talks, the prospect of membership in TPP and the need for congressional approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership gave me leverage vis-a-vis the Chinese to talk to them effectively about their human rights practices. And I had modest success in doing that. By the time I left Hanoi, the Vietnamese had signed on to the UN Convention Against Torture. They had released multiple political prisoners, and they had allowed the registration of an increased number of unofficial churches, Christian churches in Vietnam. They also signed on to the labor provisions of the TPP. That way of thinking lost out in Washington when President Obama delayed submission of TPP to Congress and when President Trump pulled us completely out of the TPP in 2017. The West's effort to gain geopolitical advantage in Southeast Asia, as well as economic advantage by influencing regional standards and norms, could be compensated for only partially by the Japanese establishment of the CPTPP. I think the Vietnam case demonstrates that international economic policy, or geoeconomics, is only useful in increasing our wealth, is not only useful in increasing our wealth and assuring our prosperity, it's also useful in pursuing our geopolitical goals. Geoeconomics is the use, after all, is the use of international economic policy for geopolitical ends. The shapers of our containment policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and early 1950s understood that economic policy must be tied to geopolitics in order for national strategy to be successful. They welded together our economic goals and our geopolitical goals and established a thriving Western world order based not only on liberal economic relationships, but on military alliances. The liberal economic order was based, as I said, the liberal economic order was based not only on bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, but on the establishment of a set of standards or rules of the road by which nations traded goods and managed international financial flows. The building of a liberal economic order served our geopolitical interests, and Japan is a case in point. With US support, the Japanese rebuilt their economy, integrated their country into the international order, and became one of that order's strongest supporters. Japan became such a strong ally because the American and Japanese supporters of the alliance believed that geoeconomic and geopolitical goals were intimately linked. I don't mean this to be another American political elite rant about our not belonging to the TPP, but I do want to highlight the growing disjunction between our geopolitical goals and our geoeconomic goals. This doesn't bode well for the presentation of, or for the construction of a new regional order. It didn't start, and I don't think it started with the first Trump administration. It started when the Obama administration failed to secure ratification of the TPP. It gathered steam in 2017 when President Trump pulled us out of the TPP and slapped tariffs not only on China, but on our allies. The trend continued under President Biden as the president decided to maintain the Trump tariffs and attempt to replace the TPP with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. From my perspective as a geopolitician, the IPEF is a damp squib. So it's also a damp squid. The administration couldn't even complete the agreement in anticipation of last year's APEC meeting, as I understand it, due to domestic political concerns in the run-up to the election. As if on cue, former President Trump announced last November, on the heels of the administration's decision not to complete IPEC, that he would kill what he called TPP-2, that is IPEF, as soon as he took office. All of this signals real incoherence in American international economic policy, that this could, over time, result in incoherence in our geopolitical strategy. When I was in embassies in Tokyo and Malaysia and Vietnam, when I went elsewhere in the region, I tried to pay close attention to what the Chinese were saying to our host governments and to publics in particularly Southeast Asia. And the message was, stick with us, the Chinese, and you'll get rich. Stick with the Americans and you'll get an aircraft carrier visit. The Chinese weren't saying that exactly, but the message was clear. Alternatively, the American business model is Blockbuster Video. The Chinese business model is Netflix. So stick with us. And the more we ignore regional economic policy or our geo-economic interests, the more successful will the Chinese be in delivering that message, those messages. What can we do to restore the link between economics and geopolitics, or the link between geoeconomics and geopolitics? I think there's little, as Ambassador Juster suggested, there doesn't seem to be much we can do in the short term. Completing IPEF might be a start. This means our allies will need to pick up the slack, as they did at the beginning of the Trump administration. A good example, of course, is Japan's substitution of CPTPP for the TPP in 2017. But the allies can't do this by themselves indefinitely. Ensuring that U.S. economic and geopolitical goals can be met will require the U.S. to produce a better effort on IPEF and a better effort at building a regional economic order. I remember in the early 1990s, when I was assigned to Embassy Tokyo, this was a period of drift in the alliance. And I remember one day sort of wringing my hands and lamenting to my boss, Russ Deming, about the drift in the alliance and about the sustainability of the alliance. And he looked at me and said, it's ours to lose. And I think that remains as true now as it did in the early 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. For your excellent views on the geoeconomics. And I have a couple of questions, but maybe it's, of course, it's left to the discussion time. Well, IPEF, you severely criticized. Certainly, it doesn't include any point on market access, so that might be useless efforts. But still, it can be interpreted as an effort to, encourage the ASEAN countries to promote structural economic reform. With the introduction of sort of the economic cooperation efforts to promote build up initiative, infrastructure, build up infrastructure in that region. But anyway, we can discuss that later. And the next speaker is, as I said, Mr. Tanigawa from Keidanren office in Washington, D.C. He's only one business representative in this session. So I'm sure he is going to give us a very productive and insightful views on as a business representative. So please, you have 10 minutes.
So thank you for JEF and Russia Center for hosting this important event. And it's my honor to be in this panel. Keidanren is a business association representing Japanese businesses with its membership of more than 1,500 major companies, 100 industrial organizations, and regional employer associations in all prefectures in Japan. And as the leading voice of business, we are heavily engaged in policymaking, both in Japan and internationally. Economic integration through increased trade and investments has brought benefits to the world. Over the past 20 years or so, global trade has increased significantly, quadrupling from $6.1 trillion in 2001 to $24 trillion in 2023. While the proportion of people living in extreme poverty have decreased by 75% since 1990. And business has played a significant role by providing innovative goods and services at affordable cost to the world through global supply chains. I started my career at Keidanren more than 20 years ago. And that time, the three role that I was assigned was one, pursuing new business opportunities with China with its accession to the WTO. And second, deepening economic ties with Russia. And third, promoting FTAs with Asian countries. I'm surprised that the landscape has significantly changed. Today, the international order that has supported the world for nearly 80 years has been greatly shaken, and the world is becoming increasingly multipolar and fragmented due to a combination of factors such as the rise of global south or the relative decline of US leaderships, economic coercion by authoritarian states in the Indo-Pacific, the growing US-China tensions, challenge to the international order, including Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Japan has long been contributing to maintain the international order led by the US, and as Japan's role has become increasingly important in this complex world, we believe that three additional efforts are necessary. I have changed the order slightly based on today's themes, but the first is to strengthen our national power. The second is to formulate international rules to address new challenges. And the third is to strengthen cooperation with the global south. National strength is the foundation for reconstructing the international order. In this regard, Japan's national security strategy, revised in 2022, called for strengthening national power. Efforts are being made on economic security to ensure strategic autonomy to avoid excessive dependence on other countries, and strategic indispensability so that Japan is needed by other countries. And it's obvious that for Japan, an island country with scarce resources, it is not realistic to achieve the strategic autonomy and indispensability on its own. Hence, it's quite natural for Japan to pursue a free and open international economic order based on the rule of law, which I will return later. In order to avoid disproportionate dependence on specific countries and regions to ensure strategic autonomy, it is necessary to develop and to protect critical technologies, strengthening supply chain resilience, and promoting friendshoring in key strategic sectors. Not to mention the like-minded countries like the G7, an important partner with which we should strengthen cooperation is the Global South. In addition, cooperation with the Global South, which is increasing its presence in the international arena, is indispensable for maintaining and strengthening the international orders. And coming back to the developing of a new international economic order, In June this year, Catering has published a policy paper on this issue. We believe that free and fair trade and investment climate should be maintained and strengthened and not further regressed. Second, elements of economic security should be incorporated into the order. And third, sustainability should be ensured. Measures taken may sometimes create tensions among these three dimensions, but it should be pursued in an integrated and mutually reinforcing manner. As for trade and investment, given the current difficulties in forming multilateral rules, we need to broaden our trade and investment networks and strengthen relations through EPAs and FTAs with strategically important countries and regions. And I was delighted that so many TPPs were shown. And in parallel with this, the WTO, a global commons that supports a rule-based multilateral trade regimes, also plays an important role. However, it is also true that the WTO is currently dysfunctional. Efforts should be made to reform the WTO, such as restoring the dispute settlement, strengthening the rule-making functions to ensure such issues as the DFFTs. Incorporating economic security is a new challenge where coordination and collective action are needed. Addressing economic corrosion by securing alternative markets or by diversifying procurement sources is feasible to some extent. However, additional measures are necessary when there are concerns about the bloc economy. The coordination platforms for economic coalitions launched at the G7 Hiroshima Summit, IPAF supply chain agreements can accelerate the collaborations among the like-minded countries. Some countries and regions are taking trade-restrictive measures under the WTO security exceptions. The risk of abuse is heightened as the scope of security expanding into the economic spheres. It is also not clear what requirements must be met to be able to take countermeasures against such trade restrictive measures. The GATT Article 21 should also be reviewed, and consideration should be given to developing rules that will curb trade restrictive measures, including economic coercions. Sustainability was covered in the previous session, but to be brief, promoting trade and investment in environmental goods, for instance, by resuming negotiations on the environmental good agreements, discussing international agreements on carbon border adjustments, such as the efforts to reach an agreement on carbon pricing and the calculation methods for emission embedded in products should be considered. I will stop here, but there are only a few ideas. These are the only a few ideas that needs to be considered, and there's always space for employing new and creative approaches to address these growing concerns. Thank you.
Okay, sure, yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Taniga, for your excellent presentation. I think for business, perhaps it will be very important to achieve predictable and stable international trade regime as quickly as possible. So perhaps in particular, the lack of WTO dispute settlement is a very crucial question to be fixed as quickly as possible. Well, I think we should move to the discussion part. And for the next 40 minutes, I would like to ask questions to the panelists. And of course, between the panelists, we can you can discuss anything. But just to provoke the discussion, I want to raise a couple of questions at first, and then maybe to each speaker, or each speaker, you can respond to those questions. It's two questions. In advance, I circulated among all the panelists. What do you think would be the critical role of the US-Japan alliance in global governance to assure business stability and economic security today? And the second question is, I think all of the panelists talked about the importance of, the resilience, strengthening resilience, and or strengthening national power. So that means, industrial policy does seem to be emerging as very important economic policy. Seemingly, also a key solution to achieve economic security, because, we have a concern about excessive dependency on certain countries' imports and certain countries' exports. So excess dependency, to correct excess dependency, we would need industrial policy to strengthen certain sectors. And again, to countervail, the so-called coercing economic or trade policies. So those two questions, what do you think about such industrial policy? Would there be a bad industrial policy or a good industrial policy in terms of trade policy perspective? So I would like to ask you, all of you, to answer those two questions. First,
Well, let me sort of step back, and I first want to amplify some of the things that David said in his presentation, because I fully agree that one of the stupidest things the United States did was pull out of the TPP, not just as an economic matter, but as a strategic matter. And both Japan and the United States share an interest in a multipolar Asia and not having China's rise lead to a hegemonic situation where it dominates Asia. But the playing field upon which China does that is the economic one. They have the most extensive trade relationships with virtually every country in the region. They have the Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure, and they have now dominate the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and have even applied to join the CPTPP, even though it's a high standards agreement and they're not able to meet those. Over time, they may well get in just because of persistence. The United States, and I also talked to my Indian friends about this, have both removed themselves from the regional architecture, economic architecture, and that just cedes the strategic ground to China and sets them back. So what Japan and the United States can do is not just bilaterally work on some of these economic issues. And as I said, they have a digital trade agreement that needs to be upgraded. And the United States, unfortunately, has pulled back from discussing digital trade issues. We have an agreement on critical minerals, but I think they need to work perhaps through the Quad. The Quad is a grouping of Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. Three countries, Australia, Japan, and India, are treaty allies. Japan, Australia, and the United States are treaty allies. India is a partner. It's not an ally for the others. And they've formed together, without ever explicitly saying it, to really provide an alternative architecture for the Indo-Pacific to what the Chinese are presenting. And they do it in terms of positive things they want to build out. And they're working on critical and emerging technologies. But an issue they haven't worked on, I think they should, is trade, because there are already trade agreements among all the countries except the United States and India. The United States, as much as I would like to see them go back into the CPTPP, simply are not prepared to do that now, although in my opinion, it should be viewed not as a trade agreement, but as a strategic agreement in a sense, as David says, the merging of geopolitics and geoeconomics. But maybe we can start to form some basis by working in the Quad on trade issues and then gradually get other countries to join on there. IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, was meant to try to have some economic program understanding that trade was the issue we really couldn't move forward on, even though it's the issue that's so important and of interest, greatest interest to all the other countries in the region, especially the small countries of Southeast Asia. And as long as we don't provide access to our market and the Chinese work with them, we're going to be falling behind in that arena, and I think hurts us in terms of trade and hurts us in terms of strategy for the broader geopolitics and architecture of the Indo-Pacific. Just a word finally on industrial policy. Look, I think for a variety of reasons, including how China has, in my view, abused the international trading system, including some of the vulnerabilities we saw in COVID-19, we do need to be sensitive to supply chains that rely on unreliable partners for critical issues and for certain technologies that are so sensitive relative to military capabilities that need to be controlled. But we need to do this in a very narrow and targeted area. We've spoken of, in this country, a small yard with high fences. Unfortunately, the yard is expanding even as the fences stay high. And we just have to try to be as targeted as we can, but continue to promote trade relations and economic relations with our friends and allies. And what happens often in our country and others is the pendulum sort of swings back and forth and overreacts to the last problem, and then you have to keep correcting it. So hopefully, optimistically, we can do it. The problem is politically, trade issues, even as I said, the Nippon Steel acquisition, you said, become hot potatoes, and domestic politics has sort of overwhelmed, I think, strategy, international strategy, and even economic analysis.
My response to the question one is the US-Japan alliance is a relationship between like-minded countries that share values. So this alliance is very important as a means to protect the liberal international order and values that are now threatened by authoritarian states. But as I focused in my presentation, the United States has often relied on unilateralism to address today's challenges. This could damage business stability. In my view, Japan should respond to this kind of unilateralism with a pragmatic approach. I mean, Japan should maintain a fair and unbiased approach to each unilateral measure and policy, and Japan should try to influence the US decision-making process to prevent problematic unilateral measures. This would help ensure the legitimacy of the United States measure and policy. It's also important for the United States and Japan to take this kind of approach when addressing the European Union's regulatory measures. Anyway, a fair and unbiased relationships between the United States and Japan is important for enhancing the legitimacy of each other's policies and to promote business stability and economic security. That's all from me. Thank you.
On the first question of what Japan and the United States can do together, first of all, I agree with Ken. I say what he says on that topic. But in addition, if I were Assistant Secretary and I were denied the use of market opening measures as a tool of statecraft, I'd try and think of ways of compensating for that. Instead of just complaining that TPP was great, which I do. But and let's look at Southeast Asia as an example. TPP was certainly the signature approach to using market opening to increase our geopolitical influence as well as our economic influence in the region. And I always thought of TPP as being an integral part of the rebalance. Now the rebalance has been shorn of a coherent regional economic policy. And I would be looking for ways of compensating. And one way of doing that, one way of restoring the level of influence that we might have lost as a result of not using market opening procedures would be to double down on development finance in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese are certainly expert, not only expert at development finance in Southeast Asia, but in many ASEAN countries, the level of Japanese development finance exceeds the Chinese level. And the Japanese adhere to DAC standards in the provision of global finance to Southeast Asian countries and others as well. So we have a very simpatico relationship on that topic. The United States, despite the 2018 BUILD Act, which increased our development finance resources by $60 billion globally, that's a drop in the bucket. I think we should double down on that and do the best we can to compensate for the lack of market opening measures while we figure out how to reinstitute market opening measures. On the subject of industrial policy, I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on industrial policy, but I think that industrial policies are necessary and can be implemented without systemic systems.
70, and it shows how broad and deep the U.S.-Japan relationship is and what to the extent that how they can cooperate. And as we have mentioned before, that like the WTO or the United Nations systems, including the UNFCCC and the climate change, is based on consensus. And we're not in the time that we can have a quite consensus in the short term. And as has been mentioned, that we have to build up the bilateral, trilateral, unilateral or plurilateral with the countries or regions that who share the same concerns on specific issues and common interests. And in the joint statement, the title was Global Partners for the Future. And that such kind of partnership doesn't limit to the bilateral between the US and Japan or the regional issues on the Northeastern Asia. It's about global. So we have to deepen the partnership to include not only the like-minded countries, but the country like the Global South. And I do think that the US-Japan can take the leaderships on that role. And in doing that, it shouldn't be exclusive, and it must not lead to protectionism. And no country should be completely isolated. So the two countries has to communicate with all the countries and coordinate where possible. And if they can, they have to take collective actions. And when we think about maintaining international order, as I mentioned in the previous presentations, the three areas that I've mentioned should not be fallen out. So we don't want to see sustainability to be fallen out. And then vice versa, we want to see more free trade agendas. And we want to see more transparency, stability on the economic security aspects that is now crucial for private sectors. And for the industrial policy, corporate actions have become to be more significant and have impacts on the realization of public policy. And the reason is that companies are more engaged in providing public goods. And technology has been the center of accomplishing public policy. And third, the operation of companies has been more global. So in that respect, it's quite natural that the government feels the need of more industrial policies or policy interventions in the market or corporate activities with the aim of realizing such public policy issues. But in realizing or implementing industrial policies, we have to always consider that it will not distort the fair competitive environment, and it should not lead to protectionism. So maybe the concept of national treatment or non-discriminatory measures should have more significance. And success of industrial policy will depend on its ability to complement or not replace the private sector's initiatives. And in that regard, close communication between the government and private sectors is essential so that the policy will be aligned with the market realities and to be effective to address the market failures.
I just wanted to add a footnote to, again, David's excellent points, because he is correct that we have to not just lament the fact that we don't have market access, but look for alternatives. And the United States has tried to work with other countries in terms of its development assistance, where Japan is a leader on developing infrastructure in countries in Asia, in part to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. But as he also said, the amount of money we have available is a drop in the bucket relative to what the Chinese put in. But the great advantage that the United States has and Japan has, and where we might be able to work together, is in leveraging our development assistance to get the private sector involved. It's something called blended finance, where the government money de-risks some of these infrastructure projects, takes the initial risk, and then you incentivize the private equity and other private players to come in, because we have a tremendous amount of private wealth that can invest. And that's where I think if we put our heads together creatively, we could up the amount of money we're putting in on infrastructure and really increase our relationships and leverage. And of course, this is how you develop relationships that buy you greater access to natural resources in some of these countries, greater use of port facilities and things that the Chinese are doing. But I think that's just another idea for us to consider jointly.
Thank you so much. That's a very good idea. Yes, please, Hirami Sensei.
I'd like to comment on industrial policy. As speakers mentioned, I think the reason for the revival of industrial policy are first, the negative effects of China's state capitalism on the competitiveness of other states' economy, and second, the need for economic security, such as supply chain resilience and so on. These factors have intensified debate in liberal countries about the need for industrial policy today. However, industrial policy implies the active role of government in the market. Typical examples are the United States CHIPS Act and the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. So measures to implement industrial policies could conflict with existing international rules such as the WTO and other trade agreements. In fact, China has claimed against the United States for the IRA at WTO dispute settlement system. So if industrial policy is necessary and useful, it is important to coordinate industrial policies among like-minded countries. Policy coordination gives the legitimacy to industrial policy itself because it can prevent the expansion of each state's own industrial policy and reduce the possibility of violating the WTO. And if industrial policy coordination clarifies the allocation of roles among like-minded countries, it will contribute to economic security. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for very specific proposals, like the importance of Quad, and also the financial initiative to promote infrastructure. I was wondering, according to what you discussed so far, perhaps it will be unfortunately very difficult for the US to contribute actively to international rule-based economy. However, there would be perhaps some, alliance efforts, including the US. Quad is one of those examples. Perhaps, the other alliance, possibly including the US, would be effective in, mitigating geopolitical challenge. As for the business perspective, perhaps they would be very keen on having rules as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the business cannot predict the stable business environment. In that sense, what do you think about the rule achieving a balance between economic security and free trade? What rule would be the best for business? Maybe many people will say today, small area, high fence. Would that be a very practical solution? But it would be very difficult, of course, how to define that small area, limited area, and high fence. But my follow-up question is on that. Anybody, if you are you can respond. You are interested in responding to this question, please go ahead.
Take a crack with a couple of points. I just was speaking last week in Hong Kong to businesses about how to deal with some of the economic risks they're facing. Fortunately, companies have greatly increased their compliance departments, their legal departments, and hired people that are now look at global risk. And the reason why this is happening is that the international system is in flux. And the system that we've had since the end of World War II is being transformed. And you look at the issue of Russia and Ukraine, they are shattering the principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty that are the bedrock of the United Nations and our international system, especially if Russia ends up keeping some of Ukrainian territory. You look at what's going on in the Middle East, and we're on the knife's edge between an all-out war and potentially a peace settlement or reestablished deterrence, but that's going to probably have, and this didn't really come up in the first panel, an impact on oil flows that go through that region and on the energy situation. Countries in Asia such as China, Japan, and India rely tremendously on oil that goes through the Middle East, whether it's from the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. And then we have in Asia, of course, the rise of China and how we're trying to adjust to that. So whether we're moving to a multipolar region where the global South and the BRICS organization is really less a coherent grouping than countries that are unhappy with the current equilibrium of power in the international system and feel that there needs to be greater recognition of their role in institutions, the question of how you reform the UN, the question of the future of the WTO. People are questioning the efficacy of the IMF and the World Bank and whether they're stuck in old criteria. And it's just not clear where this is going to be. It's going to be in a different place 5 years from now than it is today, in my opinion. There's just no doubt about that. And what's happened in the interim is we have to have creative, smaller agreements, whether they're regional, whether they're among groupings of countries, that work together. Before the Middle East situation broke out, India had announced at the G20 a India, Middle East, European economic corridor. This was meant to be sort of a whole new trade relationship that, again, was going to be different than the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are a lot of ideas and creativities. Businesses would clearly like a set of rules. We often say in business, tell us what it is and we'll do it. What we don't like is uncertainty. But the world is not complying right now with that sort of preferred framework. And I think we're going to be in a bit of a flux for a few years.
I guess I'll try this idea out on you all. And again, I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on global rulemaking, but it seems to me that if the international economic order is in flux, and if we're going to establish a new order, we can't do it by shutting China out. We need to have Chinese cooperation. And for me, the point of working together with our allies on this, particularly Japan, is not because we want to contain China or shut China out from such a new order. It's because we want maximum leverage in the competition and the negotiation with China and the BRICS, perhaps, that's going to have to take place for what appears to be an extended period.
I don't have a clear answer, but like the word de-risking or small yard high fence, The word itself is appealing, and I think that it's showing the right direction. But at the same time, it's really difficult to implement. And the technology is evolving. And even if you could have a clear rule on specific technology or export controls, it suddenly becomes outdated. So we're on the process of trial and error. And the key is that we have to find a choke point, which technology is really critical. And we also have to see that such sort of measures taken would not invoke a confusion on the supply chains. So the communication between the government and private sector is really critical. And at the same time, to make it effective, coordination among the advanced economies which have the critical technology is also critical.
If I can just add a point to what the last two comments. I mean, there's no doubt, and I'm someone who's worked on U.S.-China relations for many years, it would be fantastic if there was a way to work together on the international economic system. I think that the real rubber will hit the road on technology issues. And, right now, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have clearly indicated that they want a different system than the current world order. Where China is on this is up for discussion. I mean, the Chinese have certainly provided a lot of assistance to Russia in the war in Ukraine. It would be, and I think the United States would still be interested in trying to negotiate and work on how we can cooperate more and confront each other less. But the question, I think, will happen as these new technologies emerge. Will we be able to develop common standards and platforms and work together? Or will we see an increasing divide where the Chinese system and the Western system sort of operate differently and could try to control information differently, and whether technology creates a divide where many countries, including those in the global South who do not want to be part of a U.S.-China confrontation or choose sides, may find themselves, it's somewhat like we have sort of seen in 5G, where a number of countries felt that this was not a secure system and was really a way that China might be accessing Western infrastructure and other sensitive areas, or whether we'll be able to discuss these things together and work out common standards and a sense of trust. And I think this again remains to be determined. I'd like to be optimistic, but realistically, I'm a little pessimistic.
Thank you so much for a good discussion. As for CPTPP, I understand that we welcome Chinese participation if they fulfill the requirements to be a member of CPTPP. So we are not trying to contain China. Of course, China is our important trading partner, for Japan as well as for the United States. And let me see. Yes, so perhaps promoting free trade in principle in Asia Pacific area could be one of the Japanese missions to be promoted, which United States also implicitly expects to do. That's my understanding of what you said. Is that correct? We're promoting free trade like CPTPP or any other regional agreements, APEC, IFTA, or anything. Yeah.
Will the United States do that?
Yeah, United States is also part of IPEC, of course, but
Personally, I would like to see us, promoting free trade in Asia and being part of the regional structure. But I think now that's not on the immediate policy agenda for either of the two candidates running for president. And I hadn't realized, but I'm not surprised to hear that former President Trump says he canceled the IPEF, which is only positive. There's, being able to work together on supply chains so that there's better communication is hard to criticize, in my opinion. But so as I said, I urged Japan, and they did a great job in keeping the CPTPP together. I would urge that you maintain the high standards, and only if China can meet those high standards, including regarding state-owned enterprises, should they come into it. Otherwise, they may bring that agreement down, which I don't think would be good. I'd love to see ways, and I was saying maybe through the Quad to get the U.S. more involved, even, in trade arrangements. But I don't see President Harris pursuing that any more than the administration currently has. And surprisingly, the Biden administration has not only continued, but I think increased the tariffs of the Trump administration. As I said, I think on the face of it, President Trump looks to be more draconian, but he also is, I think, open to cutting deals to open some markets, but it will be on a bilateral basis, that he does not believe in multilateral agreements. So it'll be country by country.
Thank you so much. If there is no speaker among ourselves who would like to definitely add something to our discussion, I would move to the Q&A from the floor. If this is okay with you, speakers, okay? Yeah. So please, please.
Thank you, Haruka-san. I must say, I was really struck by this discussion in the context of our overall theme of world order. Skepticism about legalistic frameworks being really viable politically, and the importance of risk reduction and the mechanisms that do that. Some of what Ambassador just was talking about, blended finance, for example, is a way to get buy-in, infrastructure as a way to provide. If we go back to Kindleberger, classically for dominant powers in the international system, providing public goods is crucial if they're to maintain their, don't call it hegemony, but their global sort of preeminence. And so presumably in geoeconomic terms for the US and Japan, that would become important. Infrastructure, that's an obvious one. And I totally agree with what was said about that. Just wondering if there could be some add-ons in areas where we have common strengths. Someone mentioned digital trade. We'd sort of suspended. Of course, the US and Japan under President Trump did include a bilateral agreement. There seems to be interest in many of the countries across the region in that, even if this is plurilateral rather than sort of generally multilateral. Maybe some add-ons that I wonder about. I mean, we've talked about the sort of rebirth of industrial policy too. I wonder about broader dialogues that might have where the United States in part might learn from some of the examples of Japanese industrial policy or things that represent shared goals where we can think in a more systematic way and then use tools that we have, like development finance for infrastructure, and then the risk reduction functions such as DFC. To me, I mean, I can recall when Ambassador Jester, I believe, was involved in some of this in the maybe 2019 or so, some US, Japan, India quad type dialogue involving LNG plant exports and things like that. So this kind of paradigm, building on it, I wonder if that isn't one of the areas, I mean, because it produces risk reduction and it could produce economic benefits at the same time. The two countries thinking together in a strategic way, and then taking in the China factor as well. I mean, first and foremost, say quad related. At some point, where can China be included in agreements? Is there energy, for example, building on our first panel, energy efficiency in China as well as India certainly has benefits for everyone. And we noted that if it's batteries and some key technologies, China really is in a central position as well. It needs to be a give and take, but public goods for the international system, how do we produce them in a way that sustains the position of, key powers in the system?
Well, some of it is directly economic. A lot of what the Quad does is to provide public goods for the region. And so climate-related types of assistance and cybersecurity, health security, vaccines, humanitarian assistance, maritime domain assistance. And they welcome China's participation in this. These are all things designed to increase everyone's benefits overall. So I think it's a great point, and we've tried to have a cooperative agenda with China on some transnational issues relating to drugs and fentanyl, relating to climate issues, relating to cyber issues. I think with mixed results, but hopefully that's something that can be a positive element to build on.
I also agree that energy transition can be one of the agendas that we can pursue. And at the previous session, I think Ishii-san has mentioned about the AZEC, Asian Zero Emission Communities. And one of the points that I understand is that during the energy transition, there's no kind of one-size-fits-all approaches. And all the Asian countries have different energy portfolios or industrial structures, and the pathway to the carbon neutrality differentiates with each country. So we have to find a tailor-made approaches to each country and find a way that Japan can assist in that way. So incorporating like the Global South or other countries in the international order, such kind of approach can be useful in the future.
In my view, who undertakes to provide public goods is an important question. This was the role of the WTO, multilateralism. But today, multilateralism is at risk. So providing public goods is very difficult question. So, and also today, the rise of global South countries is very important. These countries key role. These countries should have key role to create, to provide public goods under WTO or other multilateral forum. But these global South countries is divided issue by issue. One area, these countries support Western countries, but the other area, in the other area, global South countries support Chinese system. So today, providing public goods is very difficult problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for a good discussion. Anything else from the floor? People worrying about lunch? どうぞね。というだ。
Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate what you have said, particularly collaboration between US and Japan and also together with ASEAN economies. But I have one question to all of you. Why Mr. Trump doesn't like TPP? Why some people don't like free trade? I think we had a similar problem in the agricultural sector, but we try to somehow conquer this problem. And some people are saying that you have a wonderful policy, trade adjustment measure. When we promote free trade, clearly there are some losers, winners and losers, and how to deal with losers is quite important. And with respect to Japan, somehow we have to provide subsidy, we have to provide opportunity for the training, the skilling for agricultural people. And I think in the United States, you have wonderful measures, trade adjustment measures. Maybe it's better for you to enhance the trade adjustment measure. I just would like to know on this particular issue. Thank you.
Take a crack at that question. You're right. There have been winners and losers over time. Of course, people who have lost their jobs, it's not only because of trade, it may be because of technology and other changes in the overall economic environment. But nonetheless, there have been communities that, for a variety of reasons, have been hollowed out. And when Trump ran in 2016, this was the constituency that he appealed to. And while traditionally, maybe some of these working class people had supported Democrats, they felt that they were not being heard there. And people, when they analyzed why Trump beat Clinton, they put a lot of weight on his appeal to this working class group that has in many ways sort of shifted the political landscape in America and changed, the Republican Party, which was once thought of as a big business party. I think this was observed by the Democrats, who are now making an equal appeal back, but it's led both parties to regard trade and China's practices in particular of dumping and subsidizing and stealing intellectual property, fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, as having been the culprit in causing these problems. And we do have trade adjustment assistance. It's not adequate and it's never really been as effective as one would like, but it's a problem that we have to deal with because communities are going to transform regardless of what the trade regimes are, in my opinion. But so that is the first premise, is that trade was bad because it created these problems in communities. Then, in addition, President Trump felt that multilateral agreements were bad because they didn't really allow you to address an issue. They were lowest common denominator agreements. And so that was just, it was not a principle that you could discuss, at length. In fact, when he pulled out of TPP, he said he wanted to do bilateral agreements, 11 bilateral agreements. We couldn't do that. You can't do that number. We did negotiate something with Japan. We renegotiated the NAFTA agreement, but we didn't do it with other countries. But I think he still is open to bilateral negotiations that he feels will level the playing field. As I mentioned, sometimes the tariffs are not even on each side. But what's happened now, it's crazy. Every country wants to have a surplus. You can't do that mathematically. But his and the U.S. View of trade has allowed other countries to sort of, take, India's become more protectionist, in my opinion, and others are doing this as well. And then the WTO system, as we've explained, is sort of broken down. So it's not a good trend. But as I think David and I said, it's a mistake strategically, as well as economically. A lot of jobs are created through trade. A lot of economic growth is created through trade. So you have to make adjustments for legitimate security reasons, but you've got to do them in a very focused way and not, do it in an overreactive way. And in my opinion, not have industrial policy that's also based on whether the unions get the jobs or what the environmental conditions are. It should be targeted on what the industrial problem is, not all these other important social issues, but that aren't part of the issue being addressed. And try then to preserving trade. Now, what is ironic is the levels of trade are still increasing, even though the tariffs are going up, things aren't working. So it's not as if the trade system is broken down. It's maybe not operating as seamlessly and efficiently as it should or could. But again, I think there's also a recognition that economic efficiency is no longer the sole criteria. There are several, what we called when I was in school, multi-attribute objective function, where you have a number of objectives, security being one, reliability, resilience, and efficiency.
That's good. I say what Ken says.
And I say what David said, violent agreement.
Thank you so much for excellent remarks. This is a time to end. I'm not summarizing the discussion, but add to my personal wish that is young people all over the world said to be more pro-globalization, not only in US or China. So I think we should be very well prepared for the future generations' interest and preference. Maybe free trade, international trade regime, needs to be restored as quickly as possible for their interest. With this, I would like to finish this session in asking you to join me in applauding to all the distinguished speakers here for their excellent performance, good presentation, and good responses to questions. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add a word too, to thank everyone for coming today. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think there's been some new ideas here coming out. So thank you, everyone. And this isn't the end for Reischauer Center. We have a number of events coming up, including one on November 6th, the day right after the election, about Trans-Pacific relations and America's presidential choice here at 555 Penn. So thanks again.
Thank you to all of our guests and speakers for participating in today's conference. Once again, I'd like to thank the Japan Economic Foundation for working with us to make this conference possible. And finally, please remember to fill out the survey before you leave. If you don't have it, it's in the conference folder. There are more of them in the boxes over there. So one of our representatives can hand those to you.
Good, thank you.
And they'd love to invest, they just don't want some of the risk. Thank you.
It goes back to Rick's introduction. It's not a legal order. It's for a rich.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's absolutely right. Energy, might be existing. Sort of build bridges across that question of security. That was right on. Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, we just put on a war game.
It's a great.
I sent them down.
Yeah, so it's just
He's so funny. He's a tiny guy.
I just thought it might be a thing.
Thanks so much.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. I was hired to make sure.
you have to announce because people are wondering what we have should be going.
It's also not everybody's.
But it's okay, isn't it? Because it's gonna
Thank you both for organizing. I was just so glad to see you there. Yeah.
be-
Anybody here who's not